boss? Why, bow, all c'était.
She built an empire from a wheelchair and never once apologized for it. He mopped floors by day and raised a daughter alone by night, a man the world had already forgotten. Then one rainy Chicago morning, their worlds collided in a hallway no one was watching, and nothing at Apex Global would ever be the same. A janitor who spoke 6 languages. A CEO who trusted no one. A conspiracy buried deep enough to kill careers. And it almost did. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Hit like, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and follow all the way to the end, because the truth doesn't come out until the very last moment. The rain started around 6:15 that morning, the kind that didn't announce itself. No thunder, no darkening sky. Just a quiet shift in the air, and then suddenly the windows of the 42nd floor were streaked with it, gray Chicago light bending through the water in long diagonal lines across the carpet. Vivian Hart noticed it the way she noticed most things, from a distance, with precision, without sentiment. She had been at her desk since 5:40. Not because she had to be, she was the CEO, she set her own hours, but because sleep had become something she negotiated with rather than surrendered to, and most mornings the negotiation ended around 4:30 with her sitting up in the dark, already thinking about quarterly numbers, or the Hanover acquisition, or the email she'd drafted and deleted 3 times the night before to the board's legal liaison. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the office by car, and her driver, Marcus, had learned years ago not to make conversation before 7. The 42nd floor was quiet at this hour. That was why she liked it. The open-plan bullpen where her department heads worked wouldn't fill up until 8:30, and even her assistant Claire didn't arrive until 7. For almost 2 hours every morning, Vivian had the floor to herself. The long windows, the hum of the HVAC system, the distant sound of the elevator cable moving in its shaft. She was 32 years old and had been running Apex Global for 14 months. The company had revenue in the range of $4 billion annually, operations in 17 countries, and a board of directors that had spent the first 8 months of her tenure waiting for her to fail. She had not failed. She had restructured the Southeast Asia division, terminated 2 contracts that were bleeding money without anyone willing to say so out loud, and negotiated a partnership with a German logistics firm that her predecessor had chased unsuccessfully for 3 years. The board had stopped waiting for her to fail somewhere around month 10, and had begun instead a different kind of watching. The kind that calculated what she was worth to them versus what she might cost them if her particular variety of stubbornness ever turned in an inconvenient direction. Vivian understood this. She had understood it from the beginning. She kept the knowledge close, the way you keep a thing that is useful precisely because it is uncomfortable. Her wheelchair was a Tie-Lite Aero Z, carbon fiber frame, custom fitted. She'd been in it for 4 years since the accident on the Eisenhower Expressway that had fractured her L1 vertebra and damaged the spinal cord below it in ways that 3 surgeons had explained to her in careful, compassionate language she had largely tuned out in favor of reading their reports herself. Partial paralysis, incomplete injury, significant function retained in her upper legs, less certainty about what the next years would bring. She had been 28. She had been on her way to a board meeting. She did not spend time thinking about the accident, she spent time working. At 6:40, she heard the cleaning cart in the hallway. She didn't look up at first. The cleaning staff came through before 7 most mornings. She was used to the sound of it, the wheels on the tile outside the glass partition, the distant mechanical whir of the floor buffer somewhere down the corridor. It was background noise. But then she heard the voices, not arguing, not the kind of thing that demanded attention, just conversation. And what caught her first was the language. Mandarin, she thought, and then she adjusted, Cantonese shifting into Mandarin, and the responses coming back in both. She looked up. Through the glass wall of her office, she could see the hallway that connected the elevator bank to the main floor. 3 men stood near the elevators. She recognized 2 of them, part of the Zhao delegation that had arrived yesterday from Hong Kong for the preliminary discussions on the Pacific Rim distribution contract. The 3rd man wore gray work pants and a shirt with the Apex Building Services logo on the chest. He had a mop bucket behind him and a lanyard clipped to his belt, and he was talking to the 2 Hong Kong executives with the kind of ease that had nothing performative in it, None of the nodding overemphasis that people put on when they were trying to demonstrate fluency. None of the careful pronunciation of someone showing off. He was just talking. One of the executives said something that made the other laugh, and the man in the gray shirt said something back, and both of them laughed harder. Vivian sat very still. The conversation shifted. She caught the change in cadence before she caught the language, and it took her a moment to place it. Bahasa Indonesia, she thought, or possibly Malay, and then one of the executives switched to English for something technical, and the janitor answered in English without missing a beat, and then they were back in Mandarin again, and whatever the janitor said made one of the executives touch his arm in the particular way that older businessmen from that part of the world indicated genuine respect. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Then the elevator arrived, the executive stepped in, and the man in the gray shirt turned back to his mop bucket. Vivian watched him for another moment. He didn't look around. He didn't check whether anyone had seen. He just moved the bucket to the next section of hallway and started working again, the way someone does when something is so ordinary to them that it doesn't register as remarkable. She looked at her computer screen. The Zhao preliminary file was open. She looked back at the hallway. He was already moving toward the far end, the cartwheels quiet on the tile. She closed the file and opened a different one, the HR portal, Building Services Division. It took her 6 minutes to find him. His name was Ethan Carter, 35. Listed as a Level 2 maintenance technician, the designation that meant senior among the cleaning and facilities staff, but was mostly a formality that came with an extra 80 cents an hour. He had been with Apex Global for 2 years and 4 months. Before that, a gap in employment records that the HR system noted without explanation. Before the gap, and this was where Vivian stopped and read the screen twice, a research position at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Department of Linguistics and Applied Communication. And before that, a consultancy called Meridian Language Group, where his title had been listed as Senior Negotiation Strategist. She sat back in her chair. The rain hit the windows. Down below, the city was starting to move. She could see headlights on the street 42 floors down, the orange glow of a traffic light cycling through its sequence. She pulled up the Meridian Language Group. It took her longer than she expected to find meaningful records. The company had dissolved, it looked like, about 5 years ago, or rather it had been absorbed, most of its contracts and a few of its people folded into a larger firm. But before that, Meridian had been cited in 3 industry publications as a boutique firm specializing in high-stakes international negotiations, primarily in Asia-Pacific markets. One article quoted a source at a major financial services company saying that Meridian's work on a Tokyo deal had saved approximately $12 million in concession value. The source had declined to name the strategist involved. Vivian looked at the hire date again. 2 years, 4 months. Before that, a gap of almost 2 years. She did the arithmetic. She went back to the main HR record. Under emergency contacts, one name, Carter, Sophie, age 9. Listed relationship, daughter. No second adult contact. Vivian closed the laptop. She sat with it for a while. The pieces of it, the shape of it, the particular kind of story it suggested. She had a talent for reading situations, had always had it, and the situation she was reading now felt like it had a weight to it that she couldn't quite place yet. She opened the laptop again and pulled up the calendar. The Zhao Group's formal meeting started at 10. There were 3 more days of preliminary sessions before the substantive negotiation would begin. She didn't make any decisions before 7 in the morning. It was a rule she kept. But she bookmarked the HR file before she closed it. Claire arrived at 7:02 with coffee and the morning brief, and by 7:30 the floor was beginning to fill. Vivian moved through the morning on its own momentum. A call with the Singapore office, a finance review with her CFO, Daniel Marsh, who had a gift for presenting bad news in a tone that implied it was actually medium news, and Vivian had just misread it. She hadn't brought up what she'd seen that morning. She hadn't decided why yet. At 10, she positioned herself at the back of the main conference room while her VP of International Partnerships, a man named Greg Pollard, led the Zhao Group through the first session of preliminary discussions. Pollard was good at the performance of international business. He wore suits that communicated the right seriousness. He had practiced the handshake protocols. He had a junior associate whispering Mandarin translations into his ear through a wireless earpiece. The Zhao executives were polite. They were also, Vivian could see, slightly bored. There was a particular quality to the way Mr. Zhao, the principal, 63, silver-haired, the kind of man who had been in rooms like this for 40 years, listened to Pollard's presentation, a carefully maintained attentiveness that masked the fact that he had already categorized everything he was hearing. During the break, she maneuvered her chair toward the window while the staff refreshed the water pitchers, and she watched the Zhao group murmur among themselves in Cantonese. She caught fragments. Not enough to understand, but enough to read the register of it. Low, quick, the cadence of people comparing notes with each other rather than performing for the room. She thought about the hallway that morning, the way the two executives had laughed. After the session, she asked Claire to find out which section of the building Ethan Carter was assigned to that afternoon. She found him on the 38th floor at 1:45, working in the corridor outside the secondary server room. He was replacing a fluorescent tube in one of the overhead fixtures, standing on the second step of a folding ladder, the dead tube held in both hands. Vivian stopped about 10 feet away. "Mr. Carter?" He looked down. If he was surprised to see the CEO of the company in a wheelchair at the end of an empty service corridor, his face didn't show it in any dramatic way. Just a slight settling, a recalibration. He climbed down from the ladder. "Yes, ma'am." Careful. Not nervous exactly. Careful. "I saw you this morning," she said, "with the Zhao group, near the elevators." He was quiet for a moment. He held the dead fluorescent tube in both hands, and she noticed he didn't try to set it down or busy himself with the ladder. He just held it and waited, which was a thing that a lot of people struggled to do. "They were looking for the 41st floor, he said. "The elevator buttons. The label is worn off on 41. "That's not what I'm asking about." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "How many languages do you speak?" A short pause. "Depends how you're counting." "Count however you want." He thought about it. Not performing thinking, just actually doing it. "Fluently? 6. Professionally functional in 4 more. Reading ability in a couple others, but I wouldn't trust myself in a live negotiation." "What does professionally functional mean to you?" "It means I can read a contract in that language, hold a business conversation, understand register and subtext, catch it if someone's being deliberately ambiguous. It doesn't mean I can give a speech." Vivian looked at him for a moment. He was taller than she'd registered from the 42nd floor, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been through something. Not scarred, nothing dramatic, just marked by time in a way that younger faces weren't. There was a small healed cut above his left eyebrow that had left a faint line. "Meridian Language Group," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not anger, but a subtle tightening, like a door closing slightly without latching. "That was a while ago," he said. 5 years. You were their lead negotiation strategist. Among other things." "What other things?" He looked at her with the kind of patience that had something harder underneath it. "I trained their junior staff. I developed their evaluation framework for identifying cultural negotiation asymmetries. I wrote most of the client-facing methodology documentation." He paused. "Is there something you need from me, Ms. Hart?" Vivian almost smiled. "I don't know yet. I'm still deciding." He waited again. It was, she thought, genuinely unusual. Most people in a conversation with her at this point would be filling the silence with reassurances or questions or the low hum of professional anxiety. He didn't do any of that. "The Zhao Group," she said. "Based on what you saw this morning, what you heard, what's your read on where they are?" He set the dead fluorescent tube carefully against the wall. "You want my honest answer or a careful one?" "I want the honest one." "They're not impressed," he said. "Not by the presentations. Mr. Zhao specifically. He's been in too many of these rooms with too many companies showing him too many PowerPoints. He's doing the politeness because he was raised to do the politeness, not because he's engaged." He paused. "The 2 guys he brought with him, the ones I ran into this morning, they told me over their coffee that the real question for them is whether Apex has anyone who actually understands how decisions get made in the way their organization makes them. They weren't asking me, they were talking to each other. They didn't think I spoke Cantonese." Vivian was quiet. "The contract structure you're presenting to them," Ethan continued, "the tiered distribution model. It's designed around Western assumptions about how risk gets allocated. In their framework, that structure implies that Apex doesn't trust them to manage volume risk, which reads as an insult disguised as a business term. They won't say that. They'll keep meeting with you and eventually find a polite way to let the deal die. Vivian stared at him. How do you know what structure we're presenting? I cleaned the conference room on the 41st floor last week. The setup materials were on the table. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without any of the self-consciousness that tended to accompany people when they realized they'd said something that landed harder than expected. What would you do differently? She asked. I don't work in your negotiations department, Ms. Hart. I'm aware of that. Answer the question. He exhaled slowly through his nose. I'd restructure the risk allocation framework so it mirrors the relational model they use internally, trust-based, long cycle, with demonstration phases instead of contractual penalties. It means Apex takes on more short-term exposure. It also means you get a partner who actually integrates you into their network, rather than treating you as a vendor they can replace. He picked up the new fluorescent tube from the ladder's small shelf. I have to finish this section before 4. I'll have someone else finish it, Vivian said. He looked at her. I want you upstairs, my office, 4:30. She turned her chair toward the elevator. Don't be late. What? She didn't tell Greg Pollard ahead of time. She told Claire to have the room ready and to pull whatever she had on the Zhao Group's corporate governance structure. And she went back to her desk and did her own reading for 2 hours, going through everything she could find on Zhao Pacific Holdings and the 2 men who had accompanied Mr. Zhao to Chicago. At 4:15, she called Daniel Marsh. I need your read on something, she said. That's never just a read, Daniel said. That's always a read with consequences. If we restructured the risk terms on the Zhao contract, took on the short-term volume exposure ourselves for the first 18 months, demonstration model approach instead of penalty clauses. Vivian. His voice had the tone of a man who wanted to close his eyes. That's a significant exposure number. I know what the number is. The board would want a detailed. I'm not asking the board. I'm asking you whether the company can absorb it if the demonstration phase doesn't perform. A pause. Technically, yes. If the rest of the portfolio holds, it's not comfortable. Comfortable isn't the goal. Since when? Since always. You just keep hoping I mean something different by that. She heard him exhale. What changed? I'll explain at 4:30. Ethan arrived at 4:28. He'd changed out of the work shirt. She assumed he kept a change of clothes somewhere, or he'd left the building briefly, though she didn't know how he would have managed that in the time. And he was wearing a plain dark sweater and the same work pants, which was fine, and he looked like someone who'd had approximately 30 minutes to decide whether to take this seriously or not, and had concluded, for reasons he hadn't fully resolved, that he would. Daniel was already there. Pollard arrived 30 seconds after Ethan and took in the scene. Vivian at the head of the table, the CFO, and a man he clearly didn't recognize, with the particular expression of someone who suspects they're about to be surprised in a way they won't enjoy. Greg, Vivian said, this is Ethan Carter. He's in building services. Pollard looked at Ethan the way a man looks at something that has appeared in a place where it has no business being. I'm sorry, building services? He's also a former senior negotiation strategist with extensive background in Asia-Pacific markets, and he speaks 6 languages fluently. She looked at Ethan. Did I get that right? Close enough, Ethan said. Pollard turned to Vivian. What exactly is the... Sit down, Greg. He sat down. Ethan, Vivian said, tell them what you told me. He did. He was more concise this time. He'd clearly organized it in the hour and a half since the corridor, and he covered the framework issue, the cultural subtext around risk allocation, and what a restructuring would need to look like to signal genuine partnership rather than contractual management. He was direct without being condescending, which Vivian suspected was a line he'd had a lot of practice walking. When he finished, the room was quiet. Daniel had been writing on his legal pad. He looked up. The exposure calculation on an 18-month demonstration phase, I can run that, Ethan said. If you give me the volume projections and their historical shipping data. Where would you get their historical? I have an estimate from the conference room setup documents. I'd want to cross-check it, but it gets you in the range. Daniel looked at Vivian. She could see him doing the thing where he was deciding whether to engage with the situation as presented or to question the situation itself. He decided to engage. Fine, let's run it. Pollard had been quiet through all of this, and when he finally spoke, his voice had the carefully managed tone of a person who is angry and does not want to look angry. Vivian, I want to be supportive here, but I have to ask, we're seriously considering restructuring a contract worth $40 million on the advice of someone who works in facilities? The room went a specific kind of still. Vivian looked at him for a moment. We're seriously considering restructuring a contract worth $40 million on the advice of someone who has more relevant expertise in this particular context than anyone else in this building. She paused. The job title is irrelevant. The board is not in this meeting, she said. I am. And I'm telling you to run the numbers with Ethan and have a revised framework proposal on my desk by 9 tomorrow morning. Pollard looked at Ethan with an expression that had several layers to it, none of them particularly warm. Ethan looked back with the particular equanimity of someone who had encountered that expression before and had learned a long time ago not to take it personally. 9 o'clock, Vivian said again. The proposal was on her desk at 8:45. She read it twice before the day started, sitting in the quiet of the early morning with the rain gone now and thin October light coming through the windows. It was good. Not just competent, actually good. The kind of document that understood what it was trying to do and did it without excess. The risk analysis was thorough but not defensive. The restructured framework was explained clearly, with a one-page executive summary that could be shown directly to the Zhao principles, if needed, formatted in the kind of clean, non-corporate language that wouldn't read as a sales pitch. There was a line near the bottom of the executive summary that she read 3 times. The proposed structure does not ask Zhao Pacific to trust Apex Global. It asks Apex Global to demonstrate that it has earned the right to be trusted. This is not a semantic distinction. She set the document down. She thought about the hallway, the mop bucket, the fluorescent tube in the service corridor, the way he'd said I have to finish this section before 4, not I should or I was planning to, just the plain declarative of a man who understood what his obligations were and intended to meet them. She thought about the daughter, Sophie, age 9. No second adult contact. She pulled up his HR file again and looked at the employment history. The gap years. The jump from senior negotiation strategist to building maintenance. It wasn't the kind of gap that happened for ordinary reasons. She looked at the proposal on her desk. She picked up her phone and called Claire. Find me a slot in Ethan Carter's schedule today. Not a formal meeting, coffee, or whatever. 30 minutes. A pause. His schedule is through the facilities coordinator. Then coordinate with the facilities coordinator. 30 minutes. What? She found him at noon in the break room on the 39th floor. He had 40 minutes for lunch according to the facilities coordinator, and he used 20 of it eating a sandwich he'd brought from home in a battered insulated bag while reviewing what looked like handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad. She brought her own coffee. She didn't ask permission to sit across from him, and he moved his notes to make room without being asked. The proposal was good, she said. Pollard did most of the formatting. I know what Pollard's formatting looks like. The analysis was yours. He took a bite of his sandwich. Tuna, she thought. He ate without ceremony, the way people did when food was fuel rather than an event. Why the facilities job? She asked. He looked at her sideways, chewing. Swallowed. I needed consistent hours. Lots of jobs have consistent hours. Lots of jobs don't let you leave at exactly 3:15 every day. He wrapped the second half of his sandwich back in the wax paper. Sophie gets out of school at 3:30. It's 4 blocks from the building. Vivian looked at him. What happened to Meridian? It shut down. Before that. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the break room window, Chicago arranged itself in its usual 40-story indifference. My wife got sick, he said. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to... He stopped. Sophie was 6. I left the consultancy when the treatment started getting intensive because there was nobody else. And when it was over, there was still nobody else. And Sophie was 7, and the world looked different than it had before. And I spent about a year not making very good decisions and running through savings I probably shouldn't have run through. He paused. The facilities job was a job that existed, that paid consistently, that let me be where I needed to be. It wasn't complicated. You're wasting your skills. My skills weren't going anywhere without me. He looked at her with a steadiness that wasn't defensive. She's 9. She's only going to be 9 once. Vivian looked at her coffee cup. She didn't say anything for a moment. The Zhao meeting is tomorrow at 10, she said. I know. Pollard sent me the agenda. He did? No? A beat. I'm guessing. She looked at him. The faintest thing crossed his face that might, under other circumstances, have been a smile. I want you in the room, she said. He went still. Not as a consultant, not formally, not yet. Pollard will have a title for you, something that keeps the board from asking questions. But I want you in the room where you can hear the negotiation directly and flag anything in real time. Pollard won't like that. Pollard doesn't have to like it. He has to be professional. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. What's in it for you? It was a direct question, the kind that most people wouldn't ask their CEO over a break room table, and she found that she didn't resent it. The deal, she said simply. That's what's in it for me. $40 million and a partner in Asia Pacific that actually works. And what's in it for me? She thought about it honestly. Probably complications, she said, and a chance to do work that's worth doing. He looked at his legal pad. He looked at his sandwich. I'll need to make arrangements for Sophie if the meeting runs late, he said. I'll have Claire look into after-school coverage. The company will cover it. He was quiet again. Is that a yes? She asked. It's a yes, he said. But if Pollard tries to sideline me during the session, I'm walking out. Fair. And I'm still on the roster for the 38th floor until we figure out what this actually is. Also fair. He picked up his legal pad and slid it across the table toward her. Those are my annotations on the Zhao governance structure. Cross-reference it with the proposal before tomorrow. She looked at the pages. Dense, precise handwriting. Margins full of notes in at least 3 different languages. She looked up. He was already rewrapping his sandwich. Thank you, she said. He shrugged once, the way someone does when they're not sure the thanks is warranted yet. Let's see how tomorrow goes first. Tomorrow went better than she had let herself expect. The meeting started at 10 and ran past 1, which was itself a signal. Zhao Pacific's principals did not linger in meetings that weren't working for them. Ethan sat at the far end of the table in borrowed business clothes that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders, and he said almost nothing for the first 90 minutes, and Vivian watched him while pretending to watch Pollard, and she saw the way he tracked the conversation. Not just the English translation that was being offered by the professional interpreter they'd hired, but the original Cantonese, the micro-expressions, the way Mr. Zhao's posture changed when a particular clause was mentioned. At the 90-minute mark, during a discussion of the revised risk framework, Ethan said 3 sentences in Cantonese. The room stopped. Mr. Zhao looked at him for the first time as though actually seeing him. What followed was 20 minutes of direct conversation between Ethan and the Zhao principals. Pollard's interpreter struggled to keep up with the technical register, eventually gave up annotating and just listened, in which the framework was discussed, adjusted, and ultimately agreed upon in its broad strokes, in a way that the previous 3 sessions of formal presentation had not managed to accomplish. After the room cleared, Pollard waited until the Zhao group was in the elevator and then turned to Vivian. That was... He stopped himself. Yes, Vivian said. How did you... Tomorrow's meeting, she said. Let's make sure Ethan has the materials the night before. She wheeled toward the door. Behind her, she heard Pollard say nothing else, which was its own kind of answer. In the elevator going back up, it was just her and Ethan and the soft mechanical sound of the cable. 3 sentences, she said. The right 3, he said. What did you say? He looked at the elevator doors. I told him that Apex understood the difference between a vendor relationship and a stewardship relationship, and that we were proposing the latter. And then I said that his grandfather built something worth stewarding, and that we understood the weight of that. How did you know about his grandfather? His grandfather founded the company in 1962. It's in the 3rd paragraph of their corporate history page. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor. Vivian held the door for a moment. You should know, she said carefully, that this is going to get more complicated. If this deal closes the way I think it's going to close, people are going to want to know who you are and where you came from, and not all of them are going to be glad about the answers. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had already considered this. Sophie has a school thing at 6, he said. I have to be there by 5:40. She let the door go. Then you should go, she said. The elevator closed. She sat in the quiet of the 42nd floor and looked at the rain-streaked windows, and the city below moved in its ordinary oblivious way, 42 floors down, and she sat with something that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not certainty, she'd never trusted certainty, but something close to the conviction that the right thing was happening, that the right person had come into the right room at the right moment. She knew, with the particular clarity that came from having been in enough rooms to know how they worked, that it wouldn't stay simple. It never did. But for now, in the quiet of the early afternoon, with the contract framework taking shape and the deal finding its footing, she let herself have just that much. The Zhao contract closed on a Thursday, 22 days after the meeting where Ethan had said 3 sentences in Cantonese and changed the temperature of the entire room. The final number was 43.8 million, slightly above the original projection, because somewhere in the last week of negotiations, a secondary distribution corridor had been added that nobody on Pollard's team had thought to propose. Ethan had suggested it on a Tuesday afternoon in a 15-minute side conversation with Mr. Zhao's deputy in Mandarin over coffee in the building's ground floor cafe, and by Wednesday it was in the draft contract. Pollard had found out about it from the legal team. He had not said anything to Vivian directly, but she had heard about his expression from 2 separate people, which told her something about how the mood was forming in the rooms she wasn't in. She didn't address it yet. She filed it away in the same place she kept all the things that weren't ready to be handled. The mental drawer that had been filling since the day she'd taken this job, the one labeled later, but not forgotten. The morning after the contract was signed, she called Ethan into her office at 7:15, before Claire arrived and before the floor filled up. He came in wearing the same dark sweater he'd worn to the Zhao meeting. She suspected he didn't own many, or that he bought the same thing repeatedly because it removed a decision from his morning routine. She'd known a few people like that. They were usually the ones who spent their mental energy on things that mattered. "Congratulations," she said. He sat across the desk in the chair that faced her. Pollard put his name on the press release. "I know. I'm not complaining. I'm noting it." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I'm going to make you a formal offer today. I want you on the international strategy team, not under Pollard, reporting directly to me. The title will be something we'll work out, because the board is going to need a title that doesn't make them ask too many questions before I've had time to manage the conversation." He was quiet. "The compensation will be a significant change from where you are now," she said. "How significant?" She told him the number. He didn't react in the way people usually reacted to a number like that. No intake of breath. No reflexive thank you. He just sat with it. "What does the role actually mean?" he said. "It means I want you in every critical international negotiation this company has. It means I want you developing a methodology that the strategy team can use, a framework for cultural asymmetry analysis that we can apply before we walk into any room anywhere in the world. It means you work for me, and you tell me what you actually think, not what sounds good. That last part I can do." "I know." He looked at the window. The morning was clear today, cold, mid-October, the sky a flat and honest blue. "Sophie has a schedule," he said. "I'm not going to be able to just... I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to do the job that matches what you actually know how to do. The hours are negotiable. The work isn't." He turned back from the window. "If I take this and it goes sideways, then it goes sideways and I deal with it. I'm the one making the offer. I'm not worried about you dealing with it. I'm worried about what sideways looks like for Sophie if I've built a new structure and then it collapses." He said it plainly, without self-pity. She's had enough structural collapse. Vivian looked at him. She thought about several responses and set most of them aside. "That's a fair concern," she said. "I can't promise you nothing will go wrong. I can tell you that I don't make offers I don't intend to back up." He looked at her steadily. There was something in the way he assessed people. Not calculating, not suspicious, but thorough. The way someone is thorough when they've learned the cost of trusting too quickly. "I'll need a week," he said. "You have it." He stood. He got to the door and then stopped without turning around. The Zhao contract. The secondary corridor clause. It was already in the original distribution map if you knew what you were looking at. Whoever negotiated their last major contract missed it. "I know." Your previous negotiation team missed about 4 things like that in the last 2 years. I've been reading the filings. She looked at the back of his head. When did you have time to read the filings? Lunch. He opened the door. I'll let you know by next Thursday. Yeah, he let her know by Tuesday. The answer was yes, delivered in a 2-sentence email with no subject line at 6:40 in the morning. I'll take the role. Sophie has after school Tuesday and Thursday. I need to leave by 5:30 those days. Vivian read it, replied, Understood. Claire will have the paperwork by noon and went back to her quarterly review. The paperwork included a title they'd settled on after some back and forth, Director of Global Negotiation Intelligence. It was specific enough to be meaningful and broad enough to avoid triggering the board's particular sensitivity about senior appointments that hadn't gone through the standard committee process. Vivian had given this title to her general counsel, Nina Reyes, who had looked at it for a long moment and said, This will hold, for now. For now was all Vivian needed. She introduced Ethan formally to the strategy team on a Wednesday morning. In a brief, unadorned meeting she called on 24 hours' notice. She stood the team together, 7 people, including Pollard, and said, Ethan Carter is joining us as Director of Global Negotiation Intelligence, reporting to me. He knows things about international negotiation that most people in this industry don't know. I expect him to be used accordingly. She did not explain his background unprompted. She did not explain the janitor part. She figured people would find out. This was a company, not a monastery, and information moved horizontally through organizations at a speed that usually outpaced the official announcements. But she wasn't going to frame it for them. Let them figure out what it meant. Pollard shook Ethan's hand. It was a professional handshake. That was what it was. Ethan said, Thanks for the introduction, to the room, and nothing else. And the meeting ended, and that was the formal beginning of it. The first 2 weeks were, in the blunt terminology that Vivian used to herself, a mixed bag. The strategy team was talented in certain narrow senses. Pollard had hired people who were good at process, good at presentation, good at the choreography of corporate deal-making. What they were not particularly good at was the thing Ethan was good at, which was the live reading of a room, the cultural subtext beneath the formal language, the gap between what a counterparty said and what they meant. This gap, in Vivian's experience, was where deals were either made or quietly destroyed. Ethan worked at a desk in the open section of the strategy floor, which Vivian had arranged deliberately. She wanted him visible, wanted the team to have to reckon with his presence as a daily fact rather than as an occasional intrusion. He had a laptop, a legal pad, and a coffee from the building cafe that he refreshed once mid-morning. He wrote by hand when he was thinking and typed when he'd finished thinking, which was a workflow that several of the younger analysts found baffling and which produced, from what Vivian could see, very good results. He was not warm in the way that smoothed social interactions in open-plan offices. He wasn't cold either. He would answer questions directly, stop what he was doing if someone needed something, engage genuinely when engaged. But he didn't do the performative friendliness that kept the ambient temperature of a corporate floor comfortable, and some of the team, she noticed, weren't sure what to do with him. One afternoon in the 3rd week, she overheard 2 of the junior analysts in the kitchen talking in the low, careful tones people used when they thought sound didn't travel. He just sits there and doesn't say anything for like 4 hours. He's reading. What is he reading? I don't know. Legal documents? Foreign ones, I think. He had a stack of stuff in Korean last week. It's weird. Like, what's his deal? Where did he come from? A pause. Facilities, I heard. What do you mean, facilities? Like, he was maintenance, like a janitor. Silence. You're kidding. That's what I heard. Vivian kept moving past the kitchen. She didn't stop. She didn't know yet whether the talk was going to be a problem in the way that required managing, or just the ordinary friction of novelty working itself out. She gave it 2 more weeks before deciding. The Meridian Park deal emerged in the 4th week. It was a mid-size pharmaceutical supply contract, a South Korean biotech company looking to expand into North American distribution channels, Apex positioned as a potential logistics partner. The Korean delegation had been in preliminary discussions with Pollard's team for 6 weeks before Vivian pulled the file and read it properly. She read it on a Sunday evening, which was not unusual. She had a way of letting things accumulate during the week and then clearing them on weekends, sitting at her apartment with the city quiet outside and the work laid out in front of her without the noise of the office. She read the Meridian Park file and felt the creeping unease of a deal that was technically progressing and substantively going nowhere. Monday morning, she put it on Ethan's desk with a note. "Read this. Tell me what you're seeing." He had it back to her by 11 with a 2-page memo and a note of his own attached. The lead negotiator on their side, Min-Jun Park, is the founder's nephew and is being tested. This is an evaluation deal for him internally, not just a business contract. Pollard's team has been treating it as a standard B2B negotiation. Wrong frame entirely. Need to restructure the approach around the relationship dynamic, not the logistics terms. She called him in. "How confident are you in this read?" she asked. "The language in their formal correspondence has shifted 3 times in 6 weeks," he said. "The register changed tracks with internal pressure. Second thing, they turned down 2 small accommodation requests that would have been easy to grant if they were negotiating in good faith on the terms. They're not stalling on terms, they're waiting for something else. The only thing that fits the pattern is internal positioning. What do you recommend? Pull Pollard from the lead role. Put someone else on the relationship side. And I need to have a direct call with Min-Jun Park before the next formal session. Not a negotiation call, a conversation. In Korean." There was the version of this conversation where she asked him if he was sure, where she buffered the recommendation with process and committees and the standard apparatus that executives use to create distance between themselves and decisions. She looked at the memo. She looked at him. "I'll talk to Pollard," she said. "He's not going to like it." "He doesn't have to like it," she paused. "For what it's worth, I'll frame it as a methodological expansion, not a replacement. I know the framing. I'm telling you how he'll take it regardless." She looked at him for a moment. "You've dealt with people like Pollard before." "I've dealt with everyone before," he said, without bitterness. The conversation with Pollard happened that afternoon, in his office, which she went to rather than summoning him to hers. A deliberate choice, the kind of spatial gesture that said, "I'm not trying to embarrass you, I'm trying to work with you." She'd found it mattered sometimes, that kind of thing. Not always, but sometimes. Pollard listened to the Meridian Park reframe with his hands flat on his desk, which was the posture he took when he was controlling his response. "I understand the logic," he said when she finished. "I want to make sure I'm understanding the structure. Ethan is leading the relationship component. My team is supporting, yes. And this call with Park will happen before the next formal session. Ethan will brief you on it." Pollard's hands moved slightly on the desk. "Vivian, I want to be direct with you." "Good. I have significant concerns about the way this dynamic is developing. I have been in this role for 4 years. I have a team that I have built and that functions. Bringing in someone from—" He stopped. "Someone with Ethan's particular background and structuring things so that he's effectively calling the shots on client relationships creates a situation that I think is going to be corrosive to the team's cohesion." She looked at him steadily. He was not wrong about all of it. She knew that. The cohesion concern was real, and she respected that he'd said it directly rather than letting it fester. "I hear that," she said. "And I'm not dismissing the team dynamic, but the Zhao deal added value because we listened to someone who knew something that the standard approach had been missing. Meridian Park is another version of that. I'm not restructuring the team. I'm expanding the tool set. The tool set has a name and a salary. Yes, and so do you." She paused. "I'm not asking you to step back from your work, Greg. I'm asking you to let a different skill set lead on specific components where it's the right fit. That's not a demotion. That's intelligent deployment." He was quiet for a moment. "And if I have concerns about specific decisions he makes, bring them to me directly, not around the floor." He nodded, which was not agreement exactly, but was the closest he could offer, and she accepted it as what it was. The call with Min-Jun Park happened on a Friday afternoon, 45 minutes, and Ethan ran it from a small conference room on the 41st floor with the door closed. Vivian wasn't in the room. She'd considered it and decided against it, deciding that her presence would change the register of the conversation in ways that wouldn't help. She had a summary from him by 6 o'clock. Call went well. Park is 31, 5 years at the company. Significant internal pressure from the board that he can't acknowledge openly. Wants the deal to succeed, but more specifically wants to demonstrate independent success. The dynamic requires us to let him have visible wins in the negotiation, not just result wins. I've drafted suggested modifications to our positions on 3 terms that we can concede in a visible way without changing our substantive outcome. We'll have the document ready Monday. Vivian read the email twice. She thought about the word us. Somewhere in the 4 weeks since he'd taken the desk in the strategy section, the pronoun had shifted without announcement. Not your positions, not Apex's positions, just our. She noted it without making anything of it and replied, "Good, Monday works." Quotes. The Monday document was, as she'd expected, excellent. The 3 suggested concessions were chosen with the kind of surgical precision that came from understanding which terms were substantive and which were symbolic, and which symbolic terms mattered most to a person trying to prove something to a room that wasn't in the negotiation. The second formal session with the Meridian Park delegation happened that Thursday. Vivian sat in, back row, observing. Ethan was at the table this time, formally introduced by Pollard as a senior member of the strategy team. Vivian watched Minjun Park's face when Ethan introduced himself in Korean. It was a small thing, a slight relaxing around the eyes, a recalibration, the look of a person who has adjusted their expectations of a room. Then Park said something in Korean, rapid, a test, and Ethan responded without hesitation, and Park said something else, and both of them laughed briefly, and whatever the test had been, Ethan had passed it. The session ran 3 hours. By the end, the framework for a letter of intent was on the table. Pollard handled the formal summary efficiently. His team had done their process work correctly. The whole thing functioned when it functioned as a collaboration. And if the collaboration was more complicated underneath than it looked from the outside, that was the cost of things that worked. The part that Vivian hadn't fully prepared for was the way the gossip evolved. By week 5, Ethan's history had filtered through the building the way all information filtered through buildings like this, in fragments, distorted by each relay, arriving at most desks as a version of the original that kept the dramatic elements and shed the context. The version that circulated on the 38th through 42nd floors was, the new strategy guy used to be a janitor here, like literally cleaned the floors, and the CEO just put him in charge of international deals. This was not entirely accurate, and not entirely inaccurate, and the gap between those 2 states was where opinion formed. Some people found it genuinely interesting. A few found it inspiring in the way that stories like this were supposed to be inspiring, which Vivian suspected would become more complicated for Ethan if people started relating to a story rather than to him. And some people, specifically, some of the people with titles and long tenure, and a particular investment in how talent was supposed to get identified and promoted in a company like this, found it threatening in the way that felt like indignation but was actually something closer to fear. She started noticing it in the peripheral movements of the company, the way certain names came up in conversations in specific combinations, the way meeting invitations were extended or not extended, the particular silences in the boardroom when Ethan's name came up in updates. There were 4 senior executives on the operations and finance side: Richard Holt, the EVP of operations, James Beaumont, Chief Risk Officer, Sandra Yee, SVP of Corporate Partnerships, and Lawrence Dade, who had the title of Deputy Board Liaison and functioned as the informal connective tissue between Vivian's leadership and the board's preferences. All 4 had been at Apex for between 8 and 15 years. All 4 had been, in one form or another, part of the established order that Vivian had inherited and not entirely overturned. She watched them the way she watched all things she didn't fully understand yet, carefully, without prematurely deciding what she was seeing. Ethan, for his part, seemed largely uninterested in the political weather. This was both admirable and, Vivian recognized, a potential vulnerability. The quality of being focused on the work to the exclusion of the surrounding landscape had a way of leaving people exposed to things they hadn't been watching. She thought about telling him. She wasn't sure how to frame it without sounding like she was warning him about something she wasn't sure existed yet. She settled for keeping the information in her own column and waiting to see what shape it took. What she noticed instead, in the 6th week, was the work. He had begun developing the methodology she'd asked for, the cultural negotiation framework. and he'd been building it the way he seemed to build most things, quietly and with more depth than the eventual document would visibly contain. He'd asked her for access to the company's last 8 years of international negotiation records, which the legal team had taken 3 days to approve, and he'd spent 2 evenings that week. She knew because the badge access logs showed him leaving at 8:30 and 9:15, working through the files. On Thursday of that week, he'd put a preliminary document on her desk that was titled simply, "Where We've Been Leaving Money." She read it over her morning coffee, and by the 3rd page had stopped drinking the coffee. The document identified 11 patterns across the 8-year negotiation history where cultural misalignment had produced either suboptimal outcomes or outright failures. Not dramatically, not in ways that had been obvious at the time, but systematically, the way a small navigational error compounds over distance. The aggregate estimate of value affected was presented in a range. He was careful about the range, noted explicitly that these were reconstructed assessments, not audited figures. But the midpoint was in the range of $60 to $80 million across 8 years. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting, "This is conservative." She sat with it for a while. $60 to $80 million wasn't the kind of number that destroyed a company the size of Apex, but it was the kind of number that, if it had been visible at the time, would have changed careers, would have prompted different decisions, would have made certain people look like what they actually were. She thought about the board. She thought about Lawrence Dade. She called Ethan in. "This document," she said, holding it, "it's preliminary. I know. I want to know who's seen it. Just you. Keep it that way for now." He looked at her with the careful attention of someone picking up something in the atmosphere. "Why?" She put the document in her desk drawer. "Because I want to understand what I'm going to do with it before anyone else knows it exists. Information like this changes how people behave, and I want to control the timing of that." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there something I'm missing about the company situation?" She looked at him. She thought again about the 4 executives, the subtle shifts in the political temperature, the particular way Lawrence Dade had looked at her in the last board prep meeting. "There might be," she said. "I'm not certain yet." "Should I be concerned?" "Keep doing the work you're doing. Do it well. And if anyone asks you for access to your files or your methodology before I've told you to share it, you come to me first." He absorbed this. That's a lot of precaution for a negotiation methodology document. It's a lot of precaution for a document that tells the board that the people they've trusted for 15 years missed $60 million in value. Things like that have a way of creating enemies before anyone actually does anything. He nodded slowly. Okay, she said. He left. She opened the desk drawer and looked at the document one more time, then closed it. 3 days later, a Thursday, she was in the back of a car on the way to an external dinner with a private equity firm when she got a call from Claire. "I thought you should know before you see it anywhere else," Claire said. Her voice had the particular careful tone she used when the news was bad enough to require delicacy. "There's something going around. It started this afternoon. I don't know where. Someone's saying that the Zhao contract has an issue. A leak." Vivian went still. "What kind of leak?" "Confidential terms. Someone is saying they were shared externally before the contract closed. The story, and it's not confirmed, I want to be clear, I heard this from 2 people who heard it from 2 other people. The story is that it came from the international strategy team." The car moved through evening traffic. The city passed the window. "Who specifically?" Vivian said. A pause. "Ethan Carter." She didn't say anything. "Vivian," Claire said, "I heard you." She looked at her own reflection in the car window. "Cancel the dinner. Send my apologies. I'm coming back to the office." "It's 7:15. "I know what time it is." She hung up. Outside, Chicago moved in the ordinary way that cities moved. Indifferent, continuous, full of people whose evenings were intact. She thought about the document in her desk drawer. She thought about the $60 million. She thought about Lawrence Dade. The car turned around. She was back in her office by 7:45, and by 8 she had Claire pulling every piece of communication from the Zhao negotiation period that touched the strategy team's output. She called Nina Reyes at home and told her to be in the office by 8:30. She did not call Ethan yet, not because she doubted him, but because she needed the information to be organized before she could have that conversation in a way that was useful rather than reactive. Nina arrived at 8:22, which was 2 minutes early, which was Nina. She closed the door and looked at the papers Vivian had laid out on the conference table. Someone's floating a leak narrative targeting Ethan Carter, Vivian said. Nina sat down. Evidence? Nothing yet. That's the problem. Right now, it's a story with no documentation and no source anyone will put their name on. Where did it originate? I'm working on that. Vivian looked at the communication logs. What I need from you right now is there any way a leak actually happened? Any pathway where the Zhao terms could have gotten out and Ethan Carter could have been the source? Nina was quiet for a moment, thinking. If the terms leaked, they'd most likely have gone through the document management system. We'd have server logs. I can have IT pull them tonight. Do that. If the logs are clean, then someone created the story without the evidence, which is its own kind of information. Vivian looked at her. And if they created it for a reason. I want to know what the reason is. Nina nodded. She pulled out her phone. I'll call IT now. One more thing, Vivian said. The document I have in my desk, Ethan's preliminary framework analysis, I want it moved to secure storage tonight, nothing connected to the shared server. Can you do that? Nina looked at her. You think this is connected to that document? I think I don't know yet, Vivian said. And not knowing is when you're careful. By 10 o'clock, the IT logs were clean. No external access to the Zhao contract terms during the negotiation period. No document transmissions from any device registered to Ethan Carter that went anywhere outside the company network. Vivian sat with this for a while. The story was fabricated. That much was clear enough. What wasn't clear was who had fabricated it, and whether it was the beginning of something or just the first move of something that had already been planned. She called Ethan at 10:15. He picked up on the second ring. In the background, she heard quiet. Sophie, presumably in bed, the apartment settled. There's a story going around, she said. Someone is saying the Zhao terms leaked and pointing at you as the source. A pause. That's not true. I know, the IT logs are clean. I needed to tell you tonight because by tomorrow morning this will be on the floor, and I don't want you hearing it from someone else first. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him exhale slowly. What do you need me to do? He said. Nothing yet. Let me understand the shape of it first. If someone asks you about it tomorrow, I'll refer them to you. Yes. Another pause. Vivian. He said her name simply, without qualification. Is this going to become a problem for Sophie? She understood what he meant. Not the career part, the other part. The stability he'd built around a 9-year-old who had already watched one structure fall apart. I'm not going to let it, she said. He was quiet again. Okay, he said. And she could hear in the word both that he accepted it and that he understood, as she did, that accepting something and being able to guarantee it were not the same thing. Get some sleep, she said. You too. She hung up and sat in the empty office. The city was dark outside except for the usual 1,000 lights. The IT report was on her desk. The drawer held Ethan's document with its careful estimate and its handwritten note at the bottom. This is conservative. She thought about what it meant that someone had chosen now to create this story, at this particular moment in Ethan's first 6 weeks, before he'd had time to build any broader relationships within the company that might protect him, before the methodology document was complete, before the board had been made to reckon with what it contained. The timing wasn't accidental. It never was. She picked up her phone and called Lawrence Dade's cell. It went to voicemail. She did not leave a message. She set the phone down on her desk and sat with the particular alertness of someone who has just understood that a thing they expected eventually has already begun. Lawrence Dade called back at 7:52 the next morning, 4 minutes after Vivian arrived at her desk. I saw a missed call, he said. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who had been thinking about the call since he'd seen it the night before. Everything all right? I wanted to check in on a few things before the board prep next week, she said. Nothing urgent. When do you have 30 minutes? I can do Friday afternoon. Friday works. She hung up and sat for a moment. He hadn't mentioned the leak story, which meant either he hadn't heard it yet, unlikely, given how it had moved through the building, or he had heard it and chosen not to raise it, which was more interesting. She filed the call in the same mental drawer as everything else and started her day. By 9 in the morning, the story had reached the official layer of the organization, meaning it had stopped being something people said to each other in hallways, and had started being something that arrived in carefully worded emails. The first came from James Beaumont, the Chief Risk Officer, at 8:47. A message addressed to Vivian and copied to Nina Reyes, noting that he had received information suggesting a potential confidentiality issue related to the Zhao contract, and that given the company's risk management protocols, he wanted to ensure the matter was being properly investigated. The language was correct. The timing was the tell. Vivian replied at 9:05, copying Nina and adding Claire. Thank you for flagging this. I initiated an IT audit last night upon learning of the concern. Preliminary results show no evidence of unauthorized data transmission. I'll have a formal report to you by end of week. She sent it and didn't wait to see how he'd respond. The second email arrived at 9:20 from Sandra Yee, SVP of Corporate Partnerships, addressed to Vivian alone. Vivian, I've heard something troubling and I think we should talk privately. Available this morning. Vivian looked at this one longer. Sandra Yee had been at Apex for 11 years and had a particular quality of operating. She was never quite at the center of anything, always at an oblique angle to it, close enough to shape outcomes, far enough to avoid fingerprints. Vivian had noted this when she took the CEO role and had neither trusted her fully nor written her off. She was the kind of person who sometimes came to you with genuine information and sometimes came to you to understand what you knew. I'll find time this afternoon, Vivian replied, and moved on. Ethan was at his desk at 9:30. She passed through the strategy floor on her way to a finance meeting and registered him without stopping. He was reading, legal pad open beside his laptop, the same quiet concentration that the junior analyst still hadn't gotten used to. He didn't look up. She didn't stop. The normalcy of it was deliberate on both their parts, she thought, though neither of them had discussed it. The finance meeting ran long because Daniel Marsh had discovered a discrepancy in the third quarter projection that he believed was an accounting classification issue and that Vivian believed was something else, and they were both professional enough to argue about it in measured terms for 40 minutes without resolving it. I want the original source documents, Vivian said at the end. It's a classification. I want the source documents, Daniel. Get them to Nina by Wednesday. He gave her the look he gave when he thought she was being excessive and accepted her position anyway, which was one of the things she actually valued about him. She was out of the meeting by 11:15 and stopped by her office for 7 minutes before the next thing, and in those 7 minutes Nina appeared in the doorway with the expression that meant she'd found something. It came back with a supplement, Nina said. She had a printed page in her hand. The logs from the document management system are clean. No external transmission. But there's something else. Someone accessed Ethan's personnel file on Monday. Full access, not just a lookup. Read his complete employment history, the pre-Apex records, the reason for hire documentation. Vivian looked at her. Who? The access was through Lawrence Dade's credentials. The office was quiet. Through the glass wall, the floor moved in its ordinary mid-morning rhythm. When Monday? Vivian said. 4:17 in the afternoon. About 2 hours before the leak story started circulating. Vivian sat back. Does Dade know we can see that? He should. It's standard policy. Whether he remembered, Nina paused. Either he didn't think about it, or he didn't care. Or he wanted us to find it eventually, Vivian said. Nina looked at her. That's a different kind of move. Yes, Vivian said. It is. Bombed. The meeting with Sandra Yee happened at 2. Sandra arrived with the specific affect of a person carrying important information, a slight elevation of purpose, a readiness, and she sat across from Vivian in the small conference room off the main hall and said, I want to be straight with you, which was what people said when they wanted you to believe they were being straight with you. Go ahead, Vivian said. There are people on the senior team who are worried about the direction of things, about the Ethan Carter situation specifically. She folded her hands. I'm not here to pile on. I'm here because I think you need to hear this from someone who isn't an adversary. And you're not an adversary. I'm trying not to be. Vivian looked at her steadily. What are people worried about specifically? The speed of it, the unconventionality, bringing someone from facilities into a senior strategy role. I understand the logic, I do. The Zhao result speaks for itself. But the way it was done, the lack of process, it's created a feeling on the senior team that normal channels don't apply anymore, that decisions are being made unilaterally. Decisions about personnel are my prerogative. Yes, they are. I'm not disputing that. I'm telling you how it feels on the ground. Sandra paused. And then this leak story, which the IT audit doesn't support. I know, but it's already out there. And Richard and James they're not going to let it sit. They're going to push for a formal investigation, which means board involvement, which means this becomes a thing that's happening, whether or not it's a real thing. Vivian was quiet for a moment. And what do you think I should do? I think you should consider whether this particular appointment is worth what it's going to cost. Not forever, just right now. Give Ethan a different role, something with less visibility. Let the temperature come down and then, no. Sandra blinked. I'm not repositioning him because some people are uncomfortable, Vivian said. And I'm not repositioning him because someone decided to start a story with no evidence behind it. She looked at Sandra with the same directness she applied to everything. If there are legitimate concerns about process, I'm willing to hear them. But the specific recommendation you just made, that's not about process. That's about removing someone because his presence is inconvenient to people who've been comfortable for a long time. Sandra held her eyes. I'm trying to help you. I know you think that. Vivian moved her chair back slightly. I appreciate that you came to me rather than going around me. That matters. But the answer is no. Sandra left. Vivian sat in the empty conference room for a moment after the door closed, and she felt the things she felt sometimes in the middle of decisions where the consequences were visible and the outcomes weren't. Not doubt exactly, more like the weight of commitment, the specific gravity of a position you've chosen and intend to hold. She wheeled back to her office and called Ethan. Are you in the building? Break room on 39. Come up. He arrived 4 minutes later. She told him about the IT audit, about Dade's access to his file, about the Sandra Yee conversation, in the same direct way she gave him all information. No softening, but no unnecessary alarm either. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He was looking at a fixed point somewhere to the left of her desk. The middle distance look of someone running calculations. Dade pulled my file 2 hours before the story started, he said. Yes? So he knew my background. He knew how it would look. That's how I read it. And the IT logs being clean, that actually doesn't matter to the narrative, does it? Because the story isn't about proving something. It's about creating enough uncertainty that the board has grounds to request an investigation, and the investigation itself becomes the problem. She looked at him. Yes. He exhaled through his nose. Okay. A pause. Does this put you in a position where the board can move against you? Not just me. That's my problem to manage. With respect, he said, if it's about my position, I'm part of the problem to manage. She considered this. Potentially. If the board formally requests an investigation and I resist it, it looks like I'm protecting someone. If I allow it, the investigation process itself creates damage regardless of the outcome. So they've built a trap. They've built a trap, she confirmed. He was quiet again. Outside the windows, the afternoon was shifting, clouds moving in from the west, the light going gray in the particular Chicago way that felt less like weather and more like a change of mind. The methodology document, he said. The $60 million analysis. Is that what this is about? I think that's part of it. If that document becomes visible to the board before the right people have context, it can be used either way. It can be used to argue mismanagement, or it can be used to ask uncomfortable questions about the people who were running strategy before I got here. She paused. People who are still on the senior team. He turned this over. So they need to discredit me before the document surfaces. Or make me pull back from relying on your analysis. Which amounts to the same thing. More or less. He looked at her. What do you need from me? Keep working. Don't change anything about how you're operating. If someone approaches you, formally or informally, about the leak story or about your history or about your methodology, you tell me immediately. Don't engage, don't defend yourself to anyone except me. And the document? Is in secure storage. Nina has it. He nodded. He looked like a man who was processing something complicated and choosing not to show the full weight of it on his face, which was, she thought, one of his most consistent qualities and probably one of his most costly ones, the practice of containing things that had nowhere adequate to go. "There's one more thing," he said. "Say it. If this gets bad, really bad, not manageable bad, I need to know that honestly. I have a 9-year-old at home who was starting to believe things might be stable." He said it without drama, just the flat honesty of someone laying a real thing on a table. "I can handle whatever happens to me. I'd just like to know before it happens to her." She met his eyes. "I will tell you honestly," she said. "That's the only thing I can promise." "That's enough," he said, and left. The board met for its regular monthly session the following Tuesday, and Vivian had spent 4 days preparing for it the way you prepared for a thing when you knew the terrain had shifted, but not exactly where the new edges were. She had her numbers in order. They were solid. The Jow contract had provided a genuine lift to the quarterly projection, the Meridian Park letter of intent added to the forward story. She had Nina beside her with the IT audit report. She had her read of the room, which she'd been calibrating since the Sandra Yee conversation, cross-referenced with everything she knew about the individuals in that boardroom. The board had 11 members. 6 she considered stable, institutional investors, 1 independent director who had been on the board before her appointment and who had consistently evaluated her on results. 3 she considered movable, people who defaulted to consensus and would follow the dominant signal in the room. 2 she watched the way you watched a thing you couldn't quite categorize yet. Lawrence Dade wasn't a board member. He was the deputy board liaison, which meant he sat in the room and communicated between the board and executive leadership and had no formal vote, but had, in Vivian's assessment, more influence than most of the formal votes. She had thought, going in, that the first move would come from Beaumont or Holt, one of the 2 executives she'd identified as the most directly threatened by Ethan's document. She had thought it would be framed as a risk management concern, properly procedural, with just enough plausibility to force a defensive response. She was right about most of that. She was wrong about where it would come from. It came from Patricia Weld, one of the 2 she couldn't categorize, a 61-year-old independent director who had been on the Apex board for 7 years, and who Vivian had always found genuinely difficult to read. Weld waited until after the quarterly results had been presented and approved, and the room had relaxed slightly into the mid-meeting lull, and then she said, in the measured voice of someone raising a procedural concern and not a personal one, "I'd like to spend a few minutes on the personnel situation that's been brought to my attention." Vivian looked at her. "There have been some concerns raised," Weld continued, "about a recent appointment to the international strategy function, and some related questions about confidentiality practices during the Jow negotiation period. I understand an IT review has been completed." She looked at Vivian. "It has," Vivian said. "The results are clean. No unauthorized transmission from any source." "I've seen the summary," Weld said, "and I don't want to prejudge anything. I do think, given the sensitivity of the contracts involved and the nature of how this particular appointment was made, that it would be appropriate to have a more formal review process. Not punitive, just proper." The room's temperature shifted in the way it shifted when a direction was being established. Beaumont said, "I'd second that. A formal review process protects everyone, including Vivian." "Including Mr. Carter," Dade added, with the smoothness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Vivian looked at each of them in turn. She felt the shape of it clearly now, the architecture of it, the way the pieces fit. A formal review, properly structured, would take weeks. It would create a period of institutional uncertainty around Ethan's role. It would legitimize the leak narrative without requiring evidence, and it would frame the methodology document, when it eventually surfaced, as the output of someone whose credibility was under review. She also knew that fighting a formal review directly, in this room, would make her look like she was protecting someone for personal rather than institutional reasons. She had 7 seconds. She'd learned, over the course of 14 months in this chair, to do a lot of thinking in 7 seconds. "I support a formal review," she said. The room shifted again. "With 2 conditions," she continued. "First, the review is conducted by external auditors, no internal team members who are parties to the original negotiation. Second, the scope of the review includes not just the Jow period, but the complete international negotiation history for the past 8 years. If we're auditing practices, we audit practices. All of them. The quiet that followed had a particular texture. Beaumont's face changed in a way he managed quickly. Dade looked at his notepad. Patricia Weld, to her credit, kept her expression neutral. An 8-year scope, Weld said carefully. That's quite broad. Well, it's the right scope if we're actually interested in negotiation practice, Vivian said. Anything narrower would be addressing a symptom rather than establishing a baseline. She looked around the room. Some of the stable board members were paying close attention in the way people paid attention when they understood that something real was happening under the surface of what was being said. I think the full scope review is appropriate, said Marcus Chen, one of the institutional board members, in the mild tone of someone who had been listening carefully. Vivian's right. If we're going to do this, we should do it properly. There was a moment of recalibration in the room. I'll support the full scope review, Patricia Weld said after a beat. The vote, when it came, was 8-3 in favor of proceeding with an external audit. The 3 who voted against were Beaumont, Holt, and a third director named Garrett, who had been quiet the entire session and whose vote told Vivian more than any speech would have. Dade didn't vote. He never did.
The meeting ended at 12:40. Vivian was in the elevator at 12:44, Nina beside her, and neither of them said anything until the elevator doors closed. The 8-year scope, Nina said. Yes. If the external auditors are thorough, they'll find what Ethan's document found. Some of it anyway. Enough. And that implicates the existing team. It implicates the existing team. Nina was quiet for a moment. Beaumont, Holt, Dade. If the audit exposes systematic mismanagement over 8 years, they'll know I've turned the table on them before the audit even begins. Vivian looked at the elevator doors, which means the next move is theirs, and it's going to come faster than a formal audit process. They don't have the luxury of patience anymore. So you've accelerated things. I've made the timeline honest, Vivian said, which is different. The elevator opened on 42.
It took 4 days. On the following Saturday morning, Vivian was at her apartment desk working through preliminary documentation on a Scandinavian partnership that her team had been slow-walking for 2 months, when her phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She didn't know why she picked up. The voice on the other end was a man she'd never spoken to. He identified himself as a former Apex compliance officer who had left the company 3 years ago, and he said he'd heard she was conducting an audit and that he had information she needed to hear. She sat very still. How did you get this number? Ethan Carter, the man said. He reached out to me this morning. He thought you should hear this directly. She looked at the wall. Tell me, she said. The man's name was Philip Okafor. He had been Apex's compliance director between 6 and 3 years ago, a period that overlapped with a significant chunk of the 8-year negotiation history Vivian had just opened to audit. He spoke for 22 minutes. He was careful, organized, and clearly had been carrying this for a long time. The kind of person who has known something he couldn't do anything useful with and has found that knowledge difficult to put down. What he described was a pattern, established over several years, in which financial reporting related to international contract outcomes had been systematically adjusted, not in ways that were detectable in a standard audit, but in ways that misrepresented the value of specific deals to the board. The adjustments had served 2 purposes. They protected certain executives from accountability for poor negotiation outcomes, and they allowed discretionary funds to be directed into arrangements that weren't properly disclosed. The executives most consistently involved, as best Okafor could reconstruct from what he'd seen, were Beaumont and Holt, with Dade functioning as the facilitator between the executive team and certain board members. Vivian asked him 3 questions. She wrote the answers on the back of the Scandinavian partnership document because it was the closest paper. Why are you coming forward now? She said. Because Carter called me, Okafor said simply. And because 3 years ago I left because I was afraid. And I've had 3 years to feel what that costs. She thanked him. She hung up. She looked at what she'd written. Then she picked the phone back up and called Ethan. He picked up on the first ring. In the background, she could hear Saturday morning sounds. It's something on a television, the low voice of a child. You called Okafor, she said. I've known him for a while. We overlapped at Meridian, He did compliance consulting for them before he went to Apex. When you described the document manipulation pattern, I thought of him. You thought of him and you called him and you told him to call me. I told him the situation and said it was his choice. She looked at her handwritten notes. Ethan, what he's describing, this is bigger than the leak story. This is financial fraud. If what he's saying is accurate, this is a criminal matter. A pause. I know. If this becomes a criminal matter, the people who started the leak story have an enormous amount more to lose. They're not going to stop at an anonymous rumor. Another pause, longer. In the background, she heard Sophie's voice, asking something, the specific question-shaped sound of a child's voice without the words being clear. Hold on, Ethan said, not to Vivian. Then, hey, give me 5 minutes. I'll make pancakes after, I promise. A door closing. Then back to Vivian. I know what it means. I need to know that you've actually thought about what it means. Not for the company, for you and Sophie. I've thought about it, he said. I spent most of last night thinking about it, which is why I called Okafor this morning. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, more like the specific weight of someone who has made a decision and is now standing in it. Here's the thing. I spent 2 years cleaning floors because I needed stable ground. I built something stable. And then I came up here and I saw that the ground was rotten underneath people who were supposed to be holding it up. A pause. I can't pretend I don't see it. Vivian was quiet. What do you need me to do? He said. I need you to compile everything you have. The methodology document, the negotiation history analysis, the pattern reconstruction. And I need names. Every name Okafor gave you, and anyone else who might have seen what he saw. I can have that by Monday morning. Make it Sunday night, she said. Sunday night arrived with a sleet that didn't quite make up its mind to be snow, and Vivian was at her apartment desk at 9:15 when the email came in from Ethan. A single attachment, a 43-page document titled Apex Global, Negotiation Value Discrepancy and Financial Reporting Irregularity Analysis, 2016 to 2024. She opened it and read it straight through without stopping. When she finished, she closed the laptop and sat in the sleet gray quiet of her apartment. The 43rd floor windows made the city look like a circuit board from here, the grid of lights in the dark, orderly and indifferent. She thought about the Eisenhower Expressway, the accident that had been 4 years ago and that she did not spend time thinking about. The conversation she'd had with the insurance investigators who had determined the accident was caused by a mechanical failure in the vehicle, a vehicle that had been serviced by a company contracted by Apex Global. The determination had been final, officially, and she had accepted it officially, and she had moved forward in the particular way she moved forward from everything, by working. But Okafor, on the phone that morning, had said something in passing, almost parenthetical, something he'd heard rather than witnessed, about pressure applied to certain contractors in the 2020 period. He'd mentioned a vehicle services contractor. He'd mentioned it in the context of a different matter, and then moved on. She had not moved on. She sat with it for a long time. The sleet against the window, the city below. She had never let herself follow that particular thread because following it required believing something that had no practical use if you couldn't prove it. And believing an unprovable thing about the worst thing that had happened to you was a way to stay inside the worst thing forever. But the document on her laptop was 43 pages of things that hadn't seemed provable until they were. And Ethan had built them from publicly available filings and meeting records and communication logs and the patient, meticulous work of someone who understood that the truth rarely announced itself. It accumulated. She opened her laptop again and typed a single line at the bottom of a new document. Eisenhower, March 2020. Greenway Vehicle Services, Apex Contract Period. She saved the document to secure storage. Nina's server, the same place as everything else, and closed the laptop. Outside, the sleet had made up its mind. It was snow now. The first of the season falling on Chicago with the indifference of all seasons, covering what was there without changing what was underneath. She thought about the board meeting on Tuesday. She thought about what was coming. She thought about Ethan in his apartment, Sophie asleep, the 43 pages sent, and the decision irreversible. She thought about Lawrence Dade's access log, the 4:17 timestamp, the 2 hours before the story started. She thought about Patricia Weld's careful face, She thought about a boardroom that had spent 14 months waiting for her to fail and what it meant that they were no longer waiting. She turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark. She wasn't afraid of what was coming. She had made a habit, over 4 years, of not being afraid of things she couldn't move away from. But she was under no illusion that the days ahead were going to be anything other than what they were, the hardest stretch of this fight, the part where the people who had been patient finally came for what they wanted. She had about 48 hours before that happened. She intended to use them. The 48 hours turned out to be 31. Monday morning arrived with the snow still on the ground and a message from Claire at 6:58. An emergency board session had been called for 2 o'clock that afternoon. The stated reason, per the official notice, was a review of executive leadership practices in response to unresolved confidentiality concerns. The unstated reason was visible in the list of who had requested it: Beaumont, Holt, and Garrett, the same 3 who had voted against the full-scope audit 4 days earlier. Vivian read the notice at her desk with her coffee going cold beside her. She called Nina first. "You saw it?" "5 minutes ago," Nina said. "I'm already pulling everything." "The 43-page document. I need printed copies." 3. Secure printer only. Done. What else? "Get me Marcus Chen's direct number, not the board line, his direct cell. I need to speak with him before noon." "Okay. And find out who retained the external audit firm we agreed on. If it was Dade's office, I want to know whether they've been contacted yet." A pause. "You think they'd interfere with the audit?" "I think I don't know what they'd do, which is why I'm asking." She set down the coffee. "One more thing. The Greenway Vehicle Services information, the note I sent to your secure server Sunday night. I need you to start pulling on that thread this morning. Whatever you can find on the public record about the Apex contract period, the service dates, any incident reports from that time." Nina was quiet for a moment. "Vivian, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I don't know yet. Pull the records and we'll see what they say." She hung up and sat for a moment in the early morning quiet. Then she called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. He was already in transit. She could hear the sound of the city behind him, wind, the muffled percussion of his footsteps. "I saw the notice," he said before she could speak. "They move faster than I expected." "What's the 2 o'clock about?" "It's a removal vote," she said. "Or the setup for one. They'll call it a confidence review or an executive practice inquiry, but the mechanics lead to the same place if they have the numbers." He was quiet for a moment. "Do they have the numbers?" "Possibly. I've been working the math since 6 this morning. It depends on Patricia Weld and 2 other movable votes. If Dade has had the weekend to work on them..." She stopped. "I need to be in that room with something that changes the calculus, not just a defense. Something that makes the people who are on the fence understand what they're actually being asked to protect." The 43 pages. The 43 pages aren't enough on their own. Their analysis, my analysis, your analysis, a former compliance officer's account. In that room, with Beaumont and Holt presenting their version, it gets framed as a competing narrative. Then what do you need? She'd been turning this over since Sunday night. "I need the original source documents, not our reconstruction of the pattern, the actual financial reporting records from the contract periods where the adjustments were made. If those records exist and show what your analysis says they show, it's not a competing narrative anymore. It's evidence." The wind in the background shifted. She heard him stop walking. "The source documents would be in the Historical Finance Archive," he said slowly. "The physical archive, not the digital system. The digital records are the adjusted ones. That's the whole point of the fraud. The original drafts, the preliminary reports before they were modified, those would be paper files, stored off system." "Do you know where?" "No, but I know who would." A pause. "Daniel Marsh." She hadn't expected that. "Daniel. He's been CFO for 6 years. If the financial reports were being adjusted over an 8-year period, some of that predates him, but not all of it. He either knew, or he found out and chose not to look directly at it, or he genuinely doesn't know, and the adjustments were made upstream of him." Another pause. "But either way, he knows where the physical archive is." Vivian thought about Daniel, his careful medium news framing, his willingness to argue with her about classifications, his face when she'd said she wanted source documents the week before. "He asked for the source documents himself," she said. "What?" "Last week, in the finance meeting. He told me there was a discrepancy in the quarterly projection, and I said I thought it was something more than a classification issue. He asked me what I meant. I asked him to pull the original source documents. She paused. He looked at me in a particular way.
What kind of way? The kind of way someone looks at you when they're deciding how much they already know. Ethan was quiet. I think he's been sitting on something, Vivian said, and I think the question is whether he'll help me before 2 o'clock today. Or whether he's already talked to Beaumont. Yes. A brief silence. Do you want me to come in? Yes, but not to the strategy floor. Come to my office directly. Don't stop anywhere on the way up. 20 minutes. He arrived in 18. She'd already called Daniel and asked him to come up at 8:30, framing it as a follow-up on the quarterly discrepancy, which was true enough that it wasn't a deception and specific enough that he'd know it was more than the surface. Daniel arrived at 8:27. He walked into her office, saw Ethan, and stopped. Daniel, Vivian said, sit down. He sat. He looked at Ethan with an expression that moved through several registers. Surprise, calculation, and then something closer to resignation, which was the one she'd been watching for. The board session this afternoon, she said. You know what it is. I've seen the notice. You've done more than see the notice. He looked at her. His hands were on the desk the way they'd been in Pollard's office weeks ago. Flat, controlled. I haven't talked to Beaumont, if that's what you're asking. Have you talked to anyone? A pause that went one beat too long. I talked to Dade on Friday. He called me. About what? About the audit scope. About what it might surface. Daniel looked down at his hands. He wanted to know if I thought there was exposure in the historical records. What did you tell him? He was quiet for a long moment. In the silence, Vivian could hear the building beginning to fill up around them. The elevator, the distant sound of voices in the bullpen. I told him I'd been working through some of the older records, and I had concerns, Daniel said. I told him I thought the board needed to understand the full picture. How did he respond? He said the board was handling it, that the afternoon session would address the leadership issues and stabilize the situation. He looked up. His definition of stabilizing and yours are probably different. Probably, Vivian said. Daniel, the original pre-adjustment financial drafts from the contract periods in Ethan's analysis. Where are they? His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A settling, like a decision being made. Physical archive, he said. Sub-basement, room B7. The system the previous CFO used kept preliminary drafts as paper copies before the documents were finalized in the digital system. Standard practice at the time, not standard anymore, but nobody cleaned out the archive when the system changed. He paused. I went down there last week, after you asked for the source documents in the meeting. And the drafts are there. His voice was measured. For 11 of the contract periods in the last 8 years, the preliminary draft numbers and the final reported numbers don't match. The differences are systematic, and they're not classification issues. The office was very quiet. Why didn't you bring this to me immediately? Vivian said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been asking himself the same question. Because I didn't know what it meant yet. Because I was trying to understand the scope before I... He stopped. Because I was afraid of what the scope meant. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without flinching. I need those documents, she said. Before 2 o'clock. I know. He stood. I'll pull them. It'll take me 2 hours. There are 11 contract periods, and I want to make sure I'm pulling the right drafts, the complete sets. He moved toward the door, then turned back. For what it's worth, I didn't know when it was happening. I found out 18 months into this job, and what I did with that information is something I'll have to live with. But I'm not going to sit in that boardroom this afternoon and watch them use a fraudulent record to take your chair. He left. Ethan looked at Vivian. Do you believe him? He said. About not knowing when it was happening? Possibly. About helping us now? She looked at the door. Yes, I think he's been waiting for an exit from the position he put himself in. We just gave him one. But the next 5 hours were the kind of hours that compressed time strangely, long in the detail and short in retrospect, each piece requiring full attention and the full picture always slightly ahead of where they were. Nina spent the morning working the Greenway thread and found it faster than Vivian had expected.
The public record on Greenway Vehicle Services was thin but not empty. The company had held an Apex Global Fleet Maintenance contract from 2018 to 2021, during which period they had serviced the executive vehicle pool. There was an NTSB adjacent incident record from March 2020, a mechanical failure report for a company vehicle, cross-referenced with an insurance claim. What Nina found was the gap. The internal Apex maintenance log from the week before the incident showed the vehicle had been serviced by Greenway 3 days prior. The work order noted brake system maintenance. The post-incident inspection had found brake system failure. These were not secret documents. They were in the company's own records, which Vivian had full access to as CEO. They had simply never been placed in sequence before. Nina put them in sequence and brought them to Vivian's office at 11:15 in a folder that she set on the desk without saying anything, because there was not much to say. Vivian looked at the documents. She looked at them for a long time. The brake maintenance 3 days before the accident, the brake failure that caused the accident, the vehicle services company under contract to Apex, the accident that had put her in this chair. She had not spent 4 years thinking about this. She had been right not to, in the sense that thinking about it without the sequence in front of you was just pain that went nowhere. But she had also been wrong not to, in the sense that the sequence had existed in these records all along, waiting to be placed in order by someone willing to look. She set the folder aside, not because she was setting it aside permanently, she knew she wasn't, but because there was a 2 o'clock meeting and the sequence had to hold. "Is there enough here for the police?" she asked Nina. "Not yet. It establishes a question, not an answer. We'd need the actual work orders from Greenway, the specific technician records, evidence of who at Apex directed the service." Nina paused. "But it's enough to open an investigation. If the right people see this sequence, they'll want to know more. Put it with the other materials. Not for this afternoon. This afternoon is about the company. But after." Nina nodded. She left. Daniel arrived back at 12:40 with 2 banker's boxes and the expression of a man who had been doing something difficult and was neither proud of it nor ashamed. 11 contract periods, he said, setting the boxes on the conference table. Complete preliminary draft sets for each. I flagged the specific pages where the numbers diverge from the final reported figures. Ethan opened the first box and spent 12 minutes going through the flagged pages with the systematic focus of someone cross-referencing against a memorized framework. He'd read his own 43-page analysis so many times in the past week that the numbers were embedded. He knew what he was looking for, and he found it in the first 3 folders he opened. "This is it," he said. He wasn't triumphant about it, just certain, the way someone is certain when the thing they suspected turns out to be exactly what it was. The preliminary drafts show the real numbers. The final reports show the adjusted ones. The delta on just the first 6 periods is over 40 million. Daniel stood at the other side of the table. "Over 8 years, it's closer to 68, he said quietly. "I ran the full calculation last week." Vivian looked between them. "Can we present this at 2 o'clock? "The documents speak for themselves," Ethan said. "We need a clear summary that any board member can follow in real time. Not a 43-page analysis, something that shows the pattern in 10 minutes flat." He looked at Vivian. "I can have that ready in an hour." 45 minutes, she said. "I need buffer time." He sat down at the table and opened his laptop. Dick. Nina had arranged for 2 of her legal team members to be present at the board session, which Vivian had approved and which she suspected would make Dade uncomfortable in ways he wouldn't be able to address without revealing that it made him uncomfortable. She also made one more call before the meeting. She called Marcus Chen at 12:50. Marcus was 64, the longest-serving institutional board member, a man who had made his money in manufacturing and who had a blunt and durable quality that Vivian had always found reliable. Not an ally, exactly, but someone who evaluated things on their merits and had enough standing in the room to move the movable votes if he chose to. "I'm going to show you something today that changes what's on the table," she told him. "I want you to know before the room, not during it." "What kind of something?" "Financial fraud, systematic, 8 years, senior executive level. I have the source documents." A pause. "How solid?" "Preliminary drafts versus final reported figures. Daniel Marsh pulled the archive this morning." Another pause. Longer. "Marsh is involved?" "He found it. He's cooperating." She paused. I need you to be prepared for what this means for the afternoon session. The people who called the meeting, they don't know what I have yet. When they find out, there's going to be an attempt to control the room. I need someone with your standing to hold the process." Marcus was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was thinking seriously, which was what she'd wanted. "I'll be there at 1:45, he said. The boardroom at 2 o'clock had the particular loaded quality of a room where everyone present understood that the stated agenda was not the real agenda, and most of them had arrived with their version of the real agenda already prepared. 11 board members, plus Dade as liaison. Vivian at one end of the table. Ethan and Nina along the wall to her left. She'd placed them deliberately, visible but not at the table, present enough to be undeniable. Daniel Marsh was at the table in his CFO capacity, which was normal. Marcus Chen was at the table and had arrived, as promised, at 1:45, and had spoken to 3 of the movable board members in the 15 minutes before the session began, in brief, quiet conversations that Vivian hadn't been part of and hadn't needed to be. Beaumont opened. He was composed, methodical, and had clearly spent the weekend preparing. His presentation of the leadership concerns was structured as a risk management matter, using the language of fiduciary responsibility and governance process with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the emotional register needed to stay. He cited the confidentiality concerns, the non-standard appointment process, the questions about the 8-year audit scope, and framed his conclusion as, given the accumulation of uncertainties, the board's responsibility was to ensure stable leadership during the review period, and the most prudent path was to request that Vivian step back from the CEO role on an interim basis pending resolution. Holt seconded it in 2 sentences. Garrett added a note about shareholder confidence. The room looked at Vivian. She did not begin her response immediately. She let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Not theatrics, just the deliberate choice not to react, to let the room understand that she wasn't operating from the defensive position they'd assigned her. Then she said, "Before we discuss leadership structure, I need to present information that is material to everything else on this agenda. Board members have a fiduciary obligation to receive material information before taking action. I'm invoking that now." Beaumont started to speak. Marcus Chen said, in the mild and immovable tone he used when he meant something completely, "Let her present." Beaumont sat back. Vivian looked at Ethan. He stood, moved to the presentation screen at the front of the room, and connected his laptop. What came up on the screen was the summary document he'd built in 45 minutes that morning, clean, spare, without excess. And he began to present it the way he presented everything, directly, without performance, the language calibrated to be followed rather than to impress. He put up the first comparative table, preliminary draft figures on the left, final reported figures on the right. Contract period 1, the delta in red. "This is from the first of 11 contract periods I'm going to show you," he said. "In each case, the left column is the preliminary financial draft, pulled this morning from the physical archive in sub-basement B7. The right column is the figure that appeared in the final board report. These are not classification differences. They are systematic adjustments, consistently in the same direction, across 8 years." He moved to the second table. Third, fourth. The room was very quiet. Patricia Weld leaned forward slightly around the 4th slide. She was looking at the documents, not at Ethan, the documents themselves, in the way of someone whose brain had already moved past shock and into analysis. By the 7th comparative table, Beaumont had stopped looking at the screen. He was looking at the table surface, and the quality of his stillness had changed from controlled to something more like braced. Holt looked at Dade. Dade looked at nothing. Ethan put up the summary table. All 11 periods, total documented discrepancy, the aggregate figure at the bottom. And then he stepped back from the screen. "The source documents are in the boxes at the end of the table," he said, "flagged and indexed. Anyone who wants to verify against what you're seeing on the screen can do that right now." No one moved to the boxes. They didn't need to. The tables had the terrible clarity of a thing that needed no elaboration. Marcus Chen looked at Beaumont. "Richard," he said, "is there an explanation for these figures that I'm not seeing?" Beaumont was silent. "James?" Marcus turned to Holt. Holt's jaw moved without producing words.
Marcus looked at Vivian. I think we have a different agenda than the one we came in with, he said.
What happened over the next 90 minutes was not clean. It rarely was. Beaumont tried twice to reframe, first suggesting the documents needed independent verification before any action could be taken, then arguing that the source of the documents needed to be established before they could be treated as reliable. The first argument was addressed by Daniel Marsh, who stated for the record that he had personally pulled the files from the archive that morning and could attest to their provenance. The second collapsed when Patricia Weld pointed out that the archive provenance was verifiable by anyone in the room. Dade said almost nothing during the 90 minutes. He sat at his position at the edge of the table and watched the room with the expression of a man recalculating. And Vivian watched him watching and thought about Sunday night, the note she'd saved to Nina's server, the brake maintenance 3 days before. There would be a time for that. It was not this afternoon. At 3:45, the board voted. Beaumont's motion to transition Vivian's leadership role failed 6-3, with 2 abstentions. The abstentions being board members who had clearly decided that neither direction was safe until the full picture was clearer. The 3 who voted for it were Beaumont himself, Holt, and Garrett, which meant the motion had lost 1 supporter from the block that had called the meeting. Someone had read the room and moved. Immediately after, Marcus Chen moved to place the financial fraud findings with the board's legal counsel for formal investigation and referral to appropriate authorities. The motion passed 9-0, with Beaumont and Holt declining to vote, which was its own statement. A secondary motion to request the resignations of Beaumont and Holt pending investigation passed 7-2. Dade was not a voting member. He sat through all of it and left the room without speaking to anyone. And Vivian tracked his exit without turning her head and thought, not yet, but soon. The room cleared in stages. Vivian stayed at the table while the board members filed out, accepting the brief nods and the quiet words of the ones who had held or shifted appropriately. Marcus paused beside her on the way out. That was well handled, he said. It's not over, she said. No, but the shape of it changed today. He left. Daniel Marsh approached her from the other side of the table. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set part of it down. Not relieved, not quite, but lighter. What happens to me? He said. It wasn't really a question. You cooperated, Vivian said. You found the documents and you brought them. That matters. She paused. There will be an investigation. You'll need to be fully transparent in it. Everything you knew and when you knew it. I understand. If you're transparent, I'll advocate for the cooperation to be a mitigating factor. I won't promise an outcome, but I'll advocate. He nodded once, the way people nodded when they understood they were getting what they could reasonably expect and not more. He left. Nina was gathering documents at the side table. Ethan had stayed in his position along the wall through the entire session. She realized she hadn't looked at him directly during the board vote, had been too focused on the numbers and the faces. She looked at him now. He looked back. He was tired. She could see it clearly. The specific tiredness that wasn't about sleep, but about the sustained effort of holding something difficult steady for hours without letting the difficulty show in the work. Vivian, he said. He stopped. What? He looked at the empty boardroom, Sal. The chairs, the half-drunk water glasses, the banker's boxes at the end of the table that contained 8 years of adjusted truth. I need to get Sophie, he said. She gets out in 40 minutes. It was such a plain and human thing to say in the aftermath of everything that had just happened in this room, and she found it. Not funny, not absurd, but grounding, the way a thing that is simply true is grounding when everything else has been complicated. Go, she said. He picked up his laptop and his legal pad. At the door, he stopped without turning around. The same gesture as the day in the service corridor weeks ago, when he'd told her about the Zhao framework, and she hadn't known yet what she had in the room with her. The Greenway documents, he said. Is Nina going to keep working on it? Yes. Let me help. When Sophie's in school. I want to help with that. She looked at his back. I know, she said. He left. She sat in the empty boardroom for a while after that. The banker's boxes, the cleared screen, the water glasses,
and the plain Monday afternoon light through the windows. Everything that had happened in this room in the last 90 minutes sat in the air the way things sat after they were over, real now in a way they hadn't been before they happened, the future rearranged by them without announcement. She thought about what Marcus had said. The shape of it changed today. It was accurate. The fraud was going to investigators. Beaumont and Holt were done, whether they knew it yet or not. The board's confidence had shifted. Not all the way, not without conditions, but meaningfully. She thought about Dade. He had left without speaking to anyone, which was the behavior of a person making calculations about what was salvageable. And in her experience, that kind of exit preceded either a lawyer's intervention or a different kind of move. She had Nina watching the Greenway thread, and she had the note in secure storage, and she had the patience that 4 years of building things slowly had given her. She thought about this brake maintenance record, and the accident report, and the 4 years she had not spent thinking about this. She thought about Ethan 3 blocks away, walking to an elementary school in the November cold to get a 9-year-old who liked pancakes on Saturday mornings, and thought stability was possible because her father had made it possible by mopping floors and eating tuna sandwiches at his desk and reading Korean legal documents on his lunch break. She stayed in the boardroom another few minutes. She was in no hurry. There was more ahead. The formal investigation, the Greenway matter, the board's trust that had to be rebuilt over time rather than declared, the work that didn't pause because today had been significant. But for this particular afternoon, in this particular room, the shape of things had changed. She turned her chair toward the door. The formal board statement went out at 5:30, drafted by Nina and reviewed by Vivian, announcing that Richard Holt and James Beaumont had stepped down from their roles pending an independent investigation into financial reporting irregularities, that the investigation would be conducted by external forensic auditors with full access to company records, and that Vivian Hart would continue in her role as CEO throughout the process. The statement did not mention Ethan Carter, which was deliberate. There would be a time for the public accounting of what had happened, how the fraud had been found, who had found it, the full story of how an analysis built in a break room on yellow legal pads had walked into a boardroom and undone 8 years of carefully maintained deception. That story would be told correctly or not at all. At 6:15, Vivian's phone showed a text from an unknown number. She almost didn't read it. It was 2 sentences. Vivian, this is Phil Okafor. I heard what happened today. Tell Carter thank you. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on her desk and looked at the city through her window. The grid of lights coming on in the November dark, the lake invisible but present at the edge of everything, the ordinary and relentless life of the city going on 42 floors below. She thought about Lawrence Dade. She thought about the brake report. She thought about the experimental rehabilitation program that the neurologist had mentioned 3 months ago in the careful language of someone managing expectations. A program in Seattle, new methodology, incomplete spinal injuries, some meaningful outcomes. She had listened and filed it and not thought about it again because thinking about it required a kind of hope she hadn't had room for. She looked at her hands on the wheels of the chair. She thought, maybe there's room now. She didn't call the neurologist that evening. She wasn't ready yet, or not quite ready, or maybe just honest enough to know that one hard day didn't resolve everything that had been accumulated over 4 years. But she thought about it. She let herself think about it without moving away from it, and that was, she recognized, something she hadn't been able to do the day before. Outside, the city. The lake somewhere in the dark beyond it. All of it indifferent, all of it continuous, all of it carrying forward whether or not any particular person was ready. She turned off her office light at 6:45 and started home. The investigation took 4 months. Not 4 clean months. 4 months of the kind of institutional unraveling that moved in uneven surges, fast in some weeks and stalled in others, with the particular rhythm of a process that was larger than any one person's ability to hurry it. The external forensic auditors worked through the physical archive in sub-basement B7 and through 11 years of digital records, and through interviews with current and former staff. And what they produced was a report that confirmed Ethan's analysis and exceeded it. The total figure of misrepresented value across the 8-year period came to $71 million, distributed across 19 contract periods, with a paper trail that was damning, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so methodical, the way sustained dishonesty always is methodical,
built in small adjustments over time by people who trusted that no one would ever place the pieces in sequence. Richard Holt resigned 3 days into the investigation when his personal attorney made it clear that cooperation was the only available strategy. James Beaumont lasted 2 weeks longer before the same logic overtook him. Both men were referred to federal prosecutors, which was not Vivian's decision. It was the board's and the external auditors and ultimately the law's. But she didn't oppose it, because opposing it would have required pretending that what they'd done was a category of thing that could be resolved internally, and it wasn't. Lawrence Dade resigned on a Thursday in December, quietly, the kind of resignation that arrived as a brief letter with no explanation and no forwarding address, and which the board accepted with the relief of people who had not quite decided how to force the issue. His letter contained one sentence of substance. I acted in the company's best interests as I understood them. Vivian read it once and put it in Nina's file, and did not spend time deciding what she thought about it as a statement, because the investigation would do that work more reliably than her opinion. The Greenway matter moved more slowly, on a separate track, with separate investigators, and it moved the way things moved when the truth being uncovered was the kind that altered not just careers, but the fundamental story of what had happened to someone's body and life. Vivian did not rush it. She had waited 4 years without knowing there was anything to wait for. She could manage a few more months now that she knew. What the investigators eventually found in February was this: the Greenway work order from March 2020 had been signed by a Greenway technician who, when interviewed, remembered the vehicle specifically because a supervisor had flagged it for particular attention. That supervisor, when found, initially said he didn't remember. Then he remembered, and what he remembered was a call from someone at the company. He wasn't certain of the name, he said, but the phone records were certain enough, and the number belonged to a line registered to a suite of offices that Lawrence Dade had used during that period. Whether the instruction had been to cause the accident or merely to create a vulnerability that might produce useful results was a question Vivian could not answer and had stopped trying to. Intent, she had learned, was sometimes the last thing you established, and the first thing you needed to release if you were going to be able to live without it. What she knew was enough. What she knew was that the accident had not been random. She sat with this for a week before she talked to anyone. Not because she didn't know what to do with it. The investigators knew, the prosecutors knew, Nina knew, and the process was moving the way processes move, but because she needed to understand what it meant for her to know it. She had been in the wheelchair for 4 years. She had built 14 months of leadership from it. She had made herself into someone who ran a $4 billion company from a carbon fiber chair and did not ask anyone to feel sorry about the distance between who she had been before and who she was now. The knowledge that the distance had been created deliberately by people she had worked beside was its own kind of thing. She felt it move through her in the week she sat with it. Not grief, not rage, something more like the cold, specific weight of a truth that reorders the landscape of the past. Everything looked the same and wasn't. The 4 years were the same 4 years. She was still in the chair, the work was still the work, but the story had a different shape now, and she had to decide what to do with a differently shaped story. She decided, in the end, that she would carry it the way she carried everything, forward without pretending it was lighter than it was. The board cleared Ethan's name in January, formally, in a written statement which Nina had insisted on and which Vivian had not needed to push for, because the board had enough self-interest to understand that the person who had helped expose a $71 million fraud deserved something more than the quiet disappearance of an unsubstantiated rumor. The statement was unambiguous. The confidentiality concerns raised in November had been investigated and found to be without factual basis. The statement named him. Vivian had read the draft and approved it without changing a word. She'd called him when it was finalized. "It's done," she said. A pause. "I saw it. How do you feel about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like it's the minimum," he said. "Which is fine. The minimum is fine." She understood what he meant. An official exoneration was the floor of what was owed, not the ceiling, and there was a version of receiving a floor-level correction that could make a person bitter if they let it. He wasn't letting it. She thought he'd earned the right to, and was choosing not to, and that distinction said something about him that she didn't have a clean word for. "There's something else," she said. "What?" I want to tell you something about the Greenway investigation, about what they found. She told him. She was direct about it. The work order, the supervisor, the phone records, Dade's connection to it. She told him because she thought he had the right to know what had actually been underneath everything, and because she trusted him with the weight of it, and because trust, she had found, was what happened when you stopped trying to protect people from the truth and started assuming they could carry it. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than usual.
How are you doing with it? He finally said.
It was not the question she'd expected. She'd expected something practical. What happens next? What does this mean for Dade's case? What are the next steps? The direct question about her was simple enough to be disarming. I'm working on it, she said honestly. That's good enough, he said. In March, Vivian flew to Seattle. She had called the neurologist in December, 3 weeks after the board session, on a Saturday morning when the city was quiet and she had run out of reasons not to. The program was called the Meridian Rehabilitation Institute, which was a coincidence that she noted and then set aside, because the world was full of coincidences that meant nothing except that language recycled itself. And it worked with incomplete spinal cord injuries using a combination of intensive physical therapy, electrical stimulation, and a surgical intervention that the neurologist had described carefully in language she'd read 3 times afterward to be sure she understood. The program director had told her at the initial consultation that she should expect something in a range. Some people recovered significant function, others recovered less. A few recovered very little. He'd given her the percentages with the kind of directness she respected, and she had gone in understanding the range and intending to occupy whatever part of it her body could manage. She stayed in Seattle for 6 weeks. She didn't talk about it much while it was happening. She checked in with Nina twice a week on the company situation. Read the documentation Ethan sent her on 2 new contract negotiations he was leading. Had a call with Marcus Chen about board composition changes that were underway following the departures. The work was the work. It continued. The physical work was harder than she'd been prepared for, which was its own information. She had been prepared for hard, and the thing that was harder than hard made her recalibrate. And the recalibration required the specific stubbornness that had gotten her through the first year after the accident, the year she didn't talk about, the year she had rebuilt herself in silence until she was functional in the way she needed to be functional. She recalibrated. She did the work. By the end of the 4th week, she could stand unassisted for 40 seconds. She stood in the rehabilitation room with the therapist beside her and the parallel bars 3 feet away. And she stood for 40 seconds and her legs shook, and she sat back down in the chair, and the therapist said something professionally encouraging, and she didn't hear it because she was looking at the floor and doing the thing she rarely let herself do, which was feeling the full weight of a moment without immediately moving past it. 40 seconds. 4 years after a brake failure on the Eisenhower Expressway, engineered by someone who thought she was a problem to be managed. 40 seconds of standing in a rehabilitation room in Seattle at the end of March. She let herself have it for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Again." And the therapist looked at her and said, "Ms. Hart, we should," and she said, "Again." And they went again. She came back to Chicago in mid-April. The company had not fallen apart in her absence, which she had known intellectually and needed to confirm experientially. Ethan had managed the day-to-day strategy function with Nina coordinating the executive layer, and the 2 new contracts, a Southeast Asian agricultural logistics deal and the reopening of a European partnership that had gone dormant, were both in late-stage negotiation and both tracking well. She came back to her office on a Tuesday and sat at her desk, and the city was out the window, and Claire brought coffee, and the morning brief arrived, and the floor filled up in its usual way, and it was, on the surface, exactly as it had always been. Under the surface, things had shifted. They had shifted in the way things shifted when you'd been through something and come back. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but in the altered quality of ordinary things. The way the morning light looked, the way she held the edge of her desk when she was thinking, the way she looked at the door to her office and understood, in some part of herself that hadn't always been sure, that she had earned the right to be there. She called Ethan up at 10 o'clock. He came in and sat across from her and looked at her, the way he always looked at her, which was directly and without performance, and said, "You look different. 6 weeks in Seattle will do that." "How different, medically speaking?" "I can walk short distances." with a cane. It's slow and it's not always reliable, and there are bad days. She looked at him. But it's there. He held her eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment, and the silence was the kind that didn't need filling. Good, he said finally. Yes. I'm glad. I know. She looked at the file on her desk. I have something for you. She slid the document across. It was a formal appointment letter. She'd written the draft herself, which was not typical, but this one she'd wanted to get right in the language. The title on the letter was Executive Director of Global Strategy. He read it. He read it twice, the way he read everything. This is a different role than what we set up in October, he said. It's the role that matches what you've actually been doing for 5 months. The compensation is in the letter. He read that line. He didn't react to the number in the way most people reacted to numbers, which she appreciated. The methodology program, he said. The framework development for the full international team. That stays in scope? That's the center of the scope. I want the whole strategy function built around that framework over the next 2 years. Not Pollard's approach with your approach attached. Your approach, rebuilt from the ground up, with a team that's selected for it. He looked at the letter again. She watched him think. The real thinking, not the performed version. Sophie has an overnight school trip next month, he said. First one she's ever been willing to go on. I need to make sure I'm available the night before. It was such a complete non sequitur and such a completely Ethan thing to say that she found something in her chest loosen slightly in a way she hadn't expected. Put it on the calendar, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression moved, briefly, contained, and then he was back to the steadiness that was his default. I'll take the role, he said. I know. He reached for the letter to take it with him, then set it back on her desk. Keep that one. I'll sign the copy. The Apex Global Leadership Center opened in June, which was later than originally planned because the construction had hit the particular kind of delay that construction always hit, and then hit another one. And then they lost a contractor and found a different one, and the whole thing ran 6 weeks past the original ribbon-cutting date, and nobody in the company was especially surprised. The building was on the west side of the campus, a renovated structure that had been a warehouse before Vivian had approved the purchase 2 years earlier, converted into a training and development center, the kind of space that announced without announcing it that the company had decided talent development wasn't an afterthought. The opening ceremony was on a Thursday in late June, the kind of clear Chicago evening that appeared occasionally between the gray stretches and felt like compensation for everything that came before it. 240 employees, board members, partners. The Zhao delegation had sent 2 representatives. Min Jun Park from Meridian Park was there in the 3rd row. Vivian had not told anyone what she intended to do. She had told Claire she would be making a few remarks, which was expected. She had told Claire she would have a guest on stage, which Claire had logged without questioning. She had told Claire to make sure Sophie Carter had a seat in the front row, which Claire had arranged without being given a reason, because Claire had been doing this job long enough to understand that reasons were sometimes given after the fact. Sophie was 9 years and 4 months old. She was sitting in the front row in a blue dress that Ethan had clearly let her pick herself. It had a small embroidered sunflower on the collar, the kind of specific detail that came from a child's decisive opinion about what they liked. And she was looking at the stage with the alert, slightly assessing expression of someone who was paying attention and wanted to understand what was happening. Ethan was backstage. He had been given 15 minutes notice about the stage part, which she had done deliberately because 15 minutes wasn't enough time to become anxious about it, only enough time to accept it. She had practiced walking the length of the stage twice that morning in the empty building with the cane. It was 34 feet from the wing to the center mark. She could do it in about 40 seconds on a good day. She had asked the event coordinator to make sure the microphone was placed at the center and not at a podium, which would have required her to stop and grip something, which was fine, but not what she wanted. She wheeled out to the center of the stage, which was the easiest part. She'd been wheeling onto stages for 14 months. She spoke for 12 minutes about the company, about what the center was intended to do, about the year that had passed. She spoke about the investigation without dwelling on it, acknowledged it as what it was, a period in which the company had been forced to reckon with what was built in its own foundation, and had done so, and had come out with its integrity more intact for having been tested rather than less. She did not use the language of triumph. She'd never trusted triumph as a category. It had a way of making people stop paying attention, and what she wanted was for the 240 people in this room to keep paying attention. Then she said, "I want to introduce someone." She looked toward the wing. Ethan came out. He was wearing a jacket that actually fit this time. She noticed this with a small, private satisfaction. And he walked to the center of the stage with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, and he stood beside her and looked out at the room in the way of someone who was not entirely comfortable with 240 people looking at him and had decided to do it anyway. In the front row, Sophie sat up straighter. Vivian looked at the room. 7 months ago, she said, this man was cleaning the floors of this building. The room was very quiet. Not as a story, not as a backdrop, as his actual job, which he had taken because he needed to be somewhere specific at 3:15 every afternoon, and because the world had not made a place for him after the hardest years of his life, and so he made a place for himself that fit the requirements he had. She paused. He is also one of the most capable people I have encountered in 20 years of working in complex organizations, and I would not have found that out if I had waited for the world to show him to me in a way I was expecting. I found it out because he was doing his job in a hallway at 6:30 in the morning, and I happened to be in the building and I happened to be paying attention. She let that sit. I tell you this not as a parable about finding diamonds in unexpected places. That framing is too easy, and it lets the rest of us off the hook. The truth is harder than that. The truth is that we miss people constantly. Not because they are hidden, but because we have built systems that only recognize talent when it arrives in the correct packaging. And the cost of that is enormous. I've seen the math. It's on the company's record for the last 8 years. A pause. And it's not just financial. She looked at Sophie in the front row. Sophie looked back at her, serious and attentive, the sunflower on her collar. Today, I am announcing Ethan Carter's appointment as Executive Director of Global Strategy, a role he has effectively held since November and which this company is formalizing because it is the right thing to do. I am also announcing a company-wide initiative, Apex Hidden Talent, which will create structured pathways for identifying and developing exceptional ability at every level of this organization, regardless of current role or title. Ethan will lead it. She looked at him beside her. He was looking at Sophie in the front row. Whatever was on his face in that moment was not the face he used at work. It was something else, something that had been under the work face the whole time, the part of a person that stays protected during the necessary hardness of getting through difficult things and surfaces only when the difficult thing has been survived. She made a decision she hadn't planned to make. She handed her cane to Ethan. He looked at her. She didn't say anything. She put her hands on the wheels of the chair and she stood up. It took her longer than it would have taken someone who hadn't been sitting for 4 years. Her legs were not fully reliable, and she knew it, and she stood anyway, carefully, the way you stood when the ground beneath you was something you had rebuilt and were learning to trust again. She stood at full height in the center of the stage, and the room was so quiet that she could hear the ventilation system and her own breathing, and from the front row, Sophie making a small sound that wasn't a word. She stood for about 20 seconds. Then she put her hand on Ethan's arm, not for balance, just because it was there. And they stood together at the center of the stage in front of 240 people, and the room began to applaud, slowly first and then fully, the kind of applause that meant something beyond the polite. She sat back down. Ethan handed her the cane without being asked, and she took it without comment, and they looked at each other in the private way of two people who have been through something together and understand that the something does not need to be summarized. In the front row, Sophie was standing on her chair. The sunflower collar, the blue dress, 9 years and 4 months, and her father on a stage instead of a hallway, and whatever understanding a child constructs from a moment like that. Not the full story, not the weight of the years, but the visible fact of it, the thing you carry forward into the rest of your life as evidence that the rest of your life is possible. Well, afterward, the three of them stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows on the building's west side, where the reception was winding down and the June evening was doing what Chicago evenings sometimes did in June, holding the light longer than felt reasonable, the sky going through its slow sequence of colors over the lake, orange, and then something that wasn't quite pink, and then a deep settled blue that wasn't yet dark. Sophie had a glass of apple juice and was pressing her nose against the glass to look at the city below. "How tall is this building?" she asked. 8 floors, Ethan said. "Are we at the top?"
We're at the top. She considered this. Your other building was taller. 42 floors. Do you miss it? He looked at her. The 42nd floor? The other job. He thought about this with genuine seriousness, the way he thought about questions when they deserved a real answer. No, he said, not the job. I miss being able to get you from school myself every day. Sophie accepted this. She went back to the window. Vivian was watching the skyline. The lake was visible from here, a strip of dark water at the edge of the city, the kind of presence that Chicago had, always at the periphery of things, reminding you that the city was built at the edge of something enormous and mostly uninterested in it. She thought about the last 8 months, the corridor on the 38th floor, the break room tuna sandwich, the boardroom with the banker's boxes, the rehabilitation room in Seattle, and the 40 seconds and then 40 more. She thought about Philip Okafor's text message, "Tell Carter thank you." She thought about Lawrence Dade, who was facing federal charges and had not, as far as she knew, said anything to anyone that could be called an accounting. She thought about the break report. She thought about the 4 years that were the 4 years they were the work, the chair, the building from the ground up. And she thought that there was no version of those 4 years she would choose to undo, not because they hadn't cost her, but because the cost was part of what she was made of now, and you couldn't separate the material from the structure without losing the structure. Some things you could not think your way around. You could only carry them forward and see what they built. Can I ask you something? Sophie said, still at the window. Sure, Vivian said. Why did you stand up? The question was pure child. Direct, without ceremony. The genuine article of wanting to know a thing. Vivian looked at her, 9 years old enough to understand more than people gave her credit for, the way children always were. Because I could, Vivian said, and because I wanted everyone in the room to know that. Sophie thought about this. Did it hurt? A little. Was it worth it? Vivian looked at the girl, then at Ethan, then back at the city in the evening light. Yes, she said. Sophie nodded, satisfied the way children were satisfied by honest answers. She went back to pressing her nose against the glass, looking down at the city from 8 floors up. The streets, the cars, the ordinary moving life of a summer evening in Chicago, and whatever a 9-year-old made of it from that height, which was probably something cleaner and more total than what adults made of it, before the years had a chance to complicate the view. Ethan stood beside Vivian without saying anything. They had gotten reasonably good at that, over the months, the comfortable silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill the space between them to confirm that the other was there. She thought that was one of the things that real familiarity looked like, not the frictionless version that people mistook for closeness, but the kind built out of difficulty and honesty and the ongoing choice to keep going. Neither of them was repaired. That was the word she'd refused from the beginning and refused still. The idea that a person could go through the things they had gone through and come out the other side restored to some prior state. She was not the person she had been before the accident. He was not the person he had been before the years of loss. What they were was different, rebuilt out of different materials with different load-bearing points, and stronger in the specific places where it mattered most. This was not a comfortable thing. It was a true thing, which was better. The light shifted. The lake went dark. Chicago arranged itself into its nighttime geometry, the grid of lights that looked from up here like something that had always been there and would always be, though of course it hadn't and wouldn't, and the people who built it had been ordinary people doing difficult things and not always knowing why. Sophie stepped back from the window. "I'm hungry," she announced. "Of course you are," Ethan said. "Can we get pizza?" "We can get pizza." She looked at Vivian. "Do you want to come?" Vivian looked at the girl, the sunflower on the collar, the apple juice, the direct and uncomplicated quality of the invitation. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with the expression of someone who already knew the answer and was waiting for her to arrive at it. "Yeah," she said. "I'll come." They left the building together. The 3 of them, the light behind them, and the city ahead, and none of them defined any longer by the worst things that had happened, and not defined yet by whatever came next, but moving toward it, which was all anyone ever had, and if you were paying attention, more than enough.